in the year 1243, as the first pale light touches the eastern hills above a Kentish valley, a farmer named Edmund begins his day as he has for 30 winters past. The earth beneath his wooden plow is cool and dark, and the oxen at his side know their work as well as he knows the turning of seasons. Good evening. It is just after 9 o'clock on this peaceful night, and I am grateful you are here. Tonight's story will carry us to the gently rolling fields of Kent in the early spring of 1243, where we will follow Edmund, a farmer of long experience, through the quiet, meditative work of the dawn plowing. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. The darkness was only just beginning to soften when Edmund stepped from his cottage, his breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. The fields were still sleeping, still quiet, still holding the peace of the night that had just passed. Around him, the village remained closed within itself, shutters drawn, smoke rising gently from chimneys, no sound but the occasional stirring of livestock in their pens. He made his way to the ox pen with the same unhurried steps he took every morning when the plowing season arrived. His oxen, Copper and Bess, knew his footfall before they saw him. They raised their heads, and Edmund spoke to them softly, calling them by names that had been their names for 7 years now. 7 years of working these fields together, 7 years of understanding how the other moved, what the other needed. The yokes were familiar in his hands. The leather had worn smooth in places, rough in others, exactly matching the shape of his palms. He worked without thinking, muscle and memory moving together as one thing. Copper stood patiently while Edmund fastened the harness, and Bess waited her turn with the quiet confidence of an animal who had learned that this work was not hard work, but proper work, the kind that made sense. The plow itself waited by the edge of the first field, and Edmund ran his hand along the wooden share that had worn to a particular shape through seasons of use. The wood was warm, even in the cool morning, as if it held within it all the days of work it had performed. He checked the joints, tested the hitch, and found everything exactly as he had left it the evening before. There was comfort in this consistency, in the way each tool knew its purpose and held itself ready. By the time Edmund led Copper and Bess to the field, the sky had begun its transformation. The darkness was not gone, but it was no longer complete. The horizon held now the faintest suggestion of the color it would become, a pale amber that seemed to glow from within the earth itself, rather than fall from the sky. The stars, which had been sharp and clear when Edmund left his cottage, had begun to fade into a softer light, and the world was suspended between two states, neither fully night nor yet truly day. The field stretched before him in gentle undulation, the earth waiting. This was always the moment Edmund loved most, this threshold between darkness and dawn, when the world was quiet and the work was pure and simple. There were no sounds but the soft footfalls of the oxen, the gentle creak of the yoke, the whisper of his own breath. He took his place behind the plow, his hands settling on the worn handles with the ease of long practice. The wood was cool against his palms. He stood for a moment without moving, feeling the ground beneath his feet, feeling the weight and readiness of the oxen before him, feeling the plow balanced between earth and sky. Then, with a word spoken softly, a sound that was not quite a word, but more a gentle signal that his oxen had learned to recognize, Edmund began to walk forward. The plow descended into the earth, and the first furrow of the day began to open behind him. It was steady work, the kind that allowed a man's mind to settle into itself. The plow moved through the soil with a soft, consistent resistance, and Edmund moved with it, his body finding the rhythm that had become second nature to him through decades of springs. He was not thinking about the plowing. His hands knew what to do, his feet knew where to place themselves, his voice knew what sounds to make to guide his animals. Instead, Edmund found his awareness drifting into the landscape around him. The light continued its slow transformation. The amber of the horizon deepened gradually into gold, and then gold began to blend with rose, so slowly that one moment seemed to contain no change at all. And yet when Edmund glanced to the side, the entire sky had shifted into new colors. The stars were nearly gone now, retreating into the brightening blue above. Copper and Bess moved forward with the steady patience of oxen who understood that this work would continue for many hours, and that rushing accomplished nothing. Edmund appreciated this about them. There was no urgency in their movement, no strain. They simply placed one hoof before the other, drew the plow forward, and continued. They had taught Edmund over these 7 years together that the only way to do difficult work was to do it gently, consistently, without complaint. The smell of the earth rose around him as the plow turned it. There was moisture in the soil still. The spring rains had left their blessing, and the scent was rich and dark and deeply peaceful. Edmund breathed it in, letting the familiar smell ground him further into the present moment. This was earth that his father had plowed and his grandfather before that. His hands had plowed it for 30 winters. Someday, perhaps, his son would plow it, and the earth would receive the plow in the same way it had always received it, with patient acceptance and quiet abundance. The first furrow was a long one, stretching from the lower edge of the field to the upper, a distance of perhaps 150 paces. Edmund did not count the steps. He had learned long ago that counting made the work feel longer. Instead, he simply walked and allowed the rhythm of walking to become the whole of his awareness. Behind him, the turned earth lay in a neat, dark line. The soil looked fresh and alive, ready for seeds that would not be planted for weeks yet. The plowing was patient work. It prepared the earth gradually, breaking up the compressed soil, turning under the old growth, making the ground receptive to what would come next. Edmund understood that his role was not to rush this process, but to participate in it with respect and attention. When he reached the top of the field, Edmund took a moment to pause. The light had changed significantly now. The sun itself had not yet risen above the horizon, but its presence was no longer a suggestion. The entire eastern sky was now painted in shades of rose and gold and pale violet. The stars had vanished completely. The world had moved from night into morning so gradually that Edmund could not point to the exact moment when the transition had occurred. He could see the village now in the middle distance. A few more chimneys had begun to smoke more heavily as people rose and began their days. The church tower rose above the cottages, solid and patient, a landmark that had stood through seasons Edmund could not remember. In the fields below him, He could see other farmers beginning their own work, far enough away that they were more impressive than people, but present enough that Edmund felt himself part of a community of workers, all engaged in this same ancient rhythm. The oxen turned now to begin the second furrow, parallel to the first. Edmund let them guide the turn, and then he took up the handles of the plow again, and they began moving down the field. The second furrow followed the first with quiet precision. Edmund had learned long ago that the quality of plowing lay not in speed but in consistency, in making each furrow as straight and even as the one before it, in letting the plow find its own depth in the earth, in trusting the oxen to maintain their steady pace. The sun was beginning to rise now, though it had not yet cleared the distant hills. The light had shifted from the soft palette of pre-dawn into something warmer, more golden. The sky above Edmund's head was no longer violet but a pale, clear blue, and the few clouds that drifted across it were edged with amber where the rising sun touched them. As Edmund worked, his mind moved through the familiar thoughts of a farmer at this season. The winter had been mild, which meant the fields had not frozen as deeply as they sometimes did. That was good. The soil would be more receptive, less bruised by frost. The spring rains had come at the right time, not too early to wash away the seeds, not so late that the earth had grown hard and cracked. This year, he thought, might be a generous year. He did not allow himself to rely too heavily on such hopes. Edmund had lived through 40 winters of harvest, and he understood that the earth gave and the earth withheld according to its own wisdom. A farmer could only do his part, the careful work, the attention, the respect for the seasons, and then accept what came. But still, on mornings like this one, with the soil in good condition and the light turning the world into something beautiful, hope was a natural thing to feel. By the time Edmund had completed 4 furrows, the sun had broken free of the horizon. It rose not with drama, but with a kind of gentle inevitability, appearing above the distant trees as if it had always been there, and was simply becoming visible now. The light changed quality again, becoming more direct, more real. Shadows appeared where before there had only been subtle gradations of tone. The world became sharply itself. Edmund's shadow stretched long before him now, cast by the rising sun behind him. He could see the shadow of Copper and Bess, and the shadow of the plow, all stretched across the darkened earth ahead. There was something peaceful about the shadow work, about seeing the shape of what he was doing reflected on the ground before him. He became aware then of hunger, not the urgent, demanding kind, but the gentle, natural hunger that came from having been awake and working for several hours. He had left his cottage before eating, as was his custom. There would be bread and cheese waiting for him when he returned at midday, and cool water drawn fresh from the well. The thought of it was pleasant but not pressing. Hunger was simply part of the rhythm of the day, another small indicator of time passing, of work accomplished, of the body's honest participation in the work it was doing. The 5th furrow turned the plow toward the path that ran along the edge of the field. Edmund could see the path clearly now, the grass worn thin in places from the passage of feet and occasional carts. Beyond the path lay the common meadow, where the village animals sometimes grazed in summer. This time of year, it was mostly empty, holding its own quiet peace, waiting for the animals that would come when the grass grew thick. As Edmund reached the midpoint of the 5th furrow, a sound reached him from the distance, the church bell ringing out across the village. He paused in his work to listen. It was not the urgent bell that called people to service or announced some event. It was the bell that marked the hours, ringing steady and clear in the morning air. Edmund counted the rings without thinking. 6. It was 6 o'clock in the morning now by the bells. 2 hours he had been at this work, though it did not feel like 2 hours. It felt like the right amount of time, the natural progression of a morning. The bell's final ring faded away into the quiet, and Edmund returned his full attention to the plow. The oxen had paused when the bell rang. They, too, seemed to mark the hours by its sound, and now Edmund encouraged them gently forward again. They resumed their steady pace without hesitation, and the plow continued its work. The warmth of the sun was becoming noticeable now on Edmund's back and shoulders. The morning had been cool, but as the sun climbed higher, it began to shed its warmth onto the world. It was not yet hot. The air still held spring's freshness, but it was warmer, and Edmund found himself grateful for it. The warmth seemed to make his muscles work more easily, as if the sun's heat were loosening something that had been tight with the cool of the pre-dawn hours. His hands on the plow handles had grown warm too. The leather was no longer cool but neutral, the same temperature as his palms, so that he could barely feel where his hands ended and the handles began. There was comfort in this, the sense of his body becoming one thing with the tool he was using, all of it unified in the single purpose of the work. By the time Edmund had completed the 6th furrow, the pattern of the plowed field was becoming clear. Where there had been only rough, old stubble and uneven earth, there was now an orderly progression of dark lines, each one marking the passage of his plow through the soil. To a farmer's eye, there was a beauty in this, the way the work created order from chaos, the way patience and attention accumulated into something visible and real. Edmund paused at the edge of the field and looked back at what he had accomplished. 6 furrows out of perhaps 20 or 25 that would be needed to complete this particular field. The work would take days, 3, perhaps 4, depending on the weather and his own pace. But that was how such work was done. You did not rush it. You did not try to complete it in a single day. You came to the field each morning, you did the work that the day could hold, and you returned the next morning to continue. This was something Edmund loved about farming, the way it taught patience, the way it gave him permission to do things slowly, to take the proper time. In the village, there were men who measured their days in haste, merchants counting coins, craftsmen competing for commissions, soldiers moving under orders. But a farmer measured his days in the seasons themselves, in the time it took for things to grow, in the patient accumulation of effort over weeks and months. The oxen were beginning to show the first signs of fatigue, nothing alarming, nothing that suggested they needed to stop, but a slight softness in their gait that suggested they had been working steadily for several hours now. Edmund understood their bodies as well as he understood his own. They were good animals, strong and patient, and they deserved to be treated with the same care he asked of them. He began the 7th furrow, but halfway through it he changed his course slightly. Instead of continuing to the far edge of the field, he guided the oxen toward the tree line at the northern boundary. There was a small stream there, barely more than a brook, that ran through the property. The water was cold and clear, fed by springs that came from deep in the earth. The walk to the stream took only a few minutes. Edmund led Copper and Bess off the plowed field and onto a smaller path that wound through scattered apple trees. These trees had been old when Edmund's father was young. Their bark was gnarled and thick with age, and their branches reached out in directions that suggested they had survived many storms and seasons of growth and dormancy. Some of them still bore the marks of old pruning, Edmund's own work from years past, when he had shaped them to encourage better bearing. The stream came into view through the trees, running clear and quiet over smooth stones. Edmund led the oxen to a spot where the bank was low and gentle, and they descended to the water. The animals lowered their heads immediately and began to drink, their movements slow and deliberate, taking in the water with the same steady patience they brought to everything they did. Edmund knelt by the stream a little distance away and cupped his hands in the cold water. He drank deeply, feeling the coolness move down his throat, reviving something in him that had not realized it was tired. The water tasted of minerals and stone and the green growing things that lived in the stream. It tasted, he thought, like the earth itself, like something essential and true. When he had finished drinking, Edmund sat back on his heels and looked at the water. The current moved gently over the stones, creating small patterns that constantly formed and dissolved. A water bird he did not recognize moved quietly along the far bank, hunting for small things in the shallows. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker was working on a tree, its knocking sound carrying through the quiet morning. This was always a good moment in the day, this pause in the work, this time to let the body rest while the oxen drank and refreshed themselves. Edmund used these moments not to think about the plowing ahead or the many tasks that still waited to be done, but simply to be present to the landscape around him. The stream, the trees, the quality of the morning light filtering through the leaves, all of it seemed to settle into him, and he felt the deep peace that came from being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. The oxen raised their heads after several minutes of drinking. They were satisfied. Edmund rose slowly to his feet and began the walk back to the field, and Copper and Bess followed with the same undemanding patience they showed in everything. The return to the field seemed to settle something in Edmund. The rest by the stream, brief as it was, had refreshed both him and the oxen. As he took up the plow handles again, he felt a quiet energy in his shoulders, a readiness to continue the work that the day held. The seventh furrow proceeded steadily, the plow moving through soil that was growing more receptive with each pass. The repeated turning was breaking up the earth, making it softer, more amenable to the work ahead. Edmund could feel the difference in the resistance of the plow. It was less heavy now, less demanding. The earth was cooperating in its patient way. As he worked, Edmund became aware of other sounds beginning to rise in the landscape around him. The day had fully begun now, and the world was waking in earnest. He could hear voices from the village in the distance, people calling to one another, going about their morning tasks. Somewhere, a child was crying, not in distress, but in the way of young children who were tired or hungry. A dog was barking, but not with urgency, more with the satisfaction of having found something interesting to investigate. The birds had grown more vocal as well. The dawn chorus had largely faded by now, but individual birds continued their songs throughout the morning. A thrush sang from somewhere in the distant trees, its voice clear and bright. Magpies called to one another in the hedgerow beyond the meadow. A rook flew overhead, its wings making a soft sound as it passed, heading toward the village where it seemed to have some business. The light had changed again, becoming more steady and true as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The long shadows of early morning had shortened considerably. Edmund's own shadow, which had stretched so dramatically when the sun first rose, now lay much closer beneath his feet. The world was becoming more itself, less painted with the strange colors of dawn, more solidly the familiar landscape he knew so well. By the time Edmund reached the end of the 7th furrow, the sun was perhaps 3/4 of the way to its midday height. He could feel the warmth more strongly now on his back and shoulders. His shirt, which had been cool against his skin in the early morning, had warmed and dried if it had ever been damp. The work was making him warm as well. His muscles were engaged, his blood was moving, and the steady physical activity was generating its own heat. He turned the oxen to begin the 8th furrow, but as he did, he noticed a figure coming along the path from the village. It was a boy. Edmund recognized him as the son of one of his neighbors, a lad of perhaps 10 or 11 winters. The boy was walking with purpose, and when he saw Edmund, he raised his hand in greeting. Edmund raised his hand in return and brought the oxen to a gentle halt. There was no hurry in this. The boy clearly had reason to seek him out, and a farmer learned long ago that such interruptions were part of the rhythm of village life. They could not be rushed or resented. They simply were. The boy reached Edmund, slightly breathless from his walk across the field. His name was Thomas, Edmund remembered. He was a serious boy, one of the quiet ones, not given to idle chatter. "My father says the miller is asking whether you will bring grain to be ground on the next market day," Thomas said, speaking in the careful way of a child delivering an important message. Edmund nodded slowly, considering. The grain from last year's harvest was nearly finished. His household would need fresh grain for flour soon enough. The miller's stone ground fine flour, the kind that made good bread, though it required payment in either coin or a portion of the grain itself. "Tell your father I thank him for the word," Edmund said, his voice gentle and measured. "Tell him I will bring what grain I have to the mill in 2 days' time, when I have finished with this field." Thomas nodded, committing the message to his memory with the seriousness that children sometimes brought to such things. He was already turning to leave when Edmund spoke again. "You are walking back to the village now?" Edmund asked. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied. "Then you might take the path by the stream," Edmund said. "There are apple trees there, and if you are careful, you might find a few early flowers beginning to open. It is pretty walking." Thomas's face brightened at this suggestion, not with excitement, but with the quiet pleasure of being given good advice. He nodded his thanks and began to walk away, but not hurried, not rushing. He was taking Edmund's suggestion seriously, already thinking about the path, about what he might see there. Edmund watched him go for a moment, then turned his attention back to the oxen and the work ahead. There was something peaceful about such interactions. The way information moved through the village, the way people checked on one another's needs, the way the community cared for itself through these small, consistent exchanges. He guided Copper and Bess forward again, and the 8th furrow began its journey across the field. The rhythm of the work had deepened now. Edmund was no longer conscious of individual movements, the guiding of the plow, the management of the oxen, the steady forward progress. Instead, these things had become one fluid motion, almost meditative in their consistency. His mind could drift while his body knew precisely what to do. He found himself thinking, as he often did while plowing, about time and seasons and cycles. This field had been plowed every spring for longer than Edmund had been alive. His grandfather had plowed it. His father had plowed it. Now Edmund plowed it, and someday, if God granted him the grace to see it, his son would plow it too. The field itself seemed to desire this plowing. It responded to it, grew better from it, produced more abundantly because of this annual turning. There was something almost holy about that, Edmund thought. The way the earth and human work collaborated, the way patience and attention and repeated effort accumulated into something that fed people, that sustained life. It was not dramatic work. It would not be remembered, but it was necessary work, and necessary work held its own quiet dignity. The 9th furrow was nearly complete when Edmund heard the bell from the village again. This time there were more rings, 9 of them, clear and steady. 9 o'clock. 3 hours now since he had begun, though again it did not feel like 3 hours. It felt like the right portion of a morning, the natural rhythm of work and rest and work again. After the 9th furrow, Edmund found himself considering a longer pause. The sun was approaching the point where it would be directly overhead, and his body was beginning to make its own argument for rest. Not urgent rest. He could have continued working for several more hours if needed, but the gentle suggestion that rest would be welcome, that his muscles would appreciate a longer break than the brief time at the stream. He guided the oxen toward the spot at the edge of the field where his cottage was visible in the distance. There was a small shelter there, a structure his father had built, little more than a roof and some posts, but enough to provide shade on a warm day. A bench sat beneath it, worn smooth by years of use, by many farmers resting in the shade during the heat of the day. Edmund tied the oxen loosely to one of the posts. They knew not to wander, had been trained since they were young to remain where they were tied, and settled himself on the bench. The shade was an immediate relief. He had not fully realized how warm the sun had become until he removed himself from its direct heat. He sat quietly for a moment, feeling the weariness in his shoulders and legs, the pleasant fatigue that came from honest work. It was not painful. Edmund's body had been doing this work for 30 years, and it knew how to do it well. But it was present, real, a testament to the effort expended. In his pocket, Edmund had brought a piece of bread and a small portion of cheese wrapped in cloth. He drew it out now and ate slowly, savoring each bite. The bread was from yesterday's baking, still soft, still good. The cheese was strong and aged, the kind that stored well through the winter. Together they made a simple meal, but it was sufficient. It was good. As he ate, Edmund's gaze drifted across the field to the work he had already completed. 8 furrows now lay in neat, dark lines across the earth. The pattern of his work was becoming clear, this orderly progression that would continue until the entire field was turned. Tomorrow he will return and add more furrows. The day after that, more still, until eventually the field would be completely prepared, ready for the seeds that would be planted in a few weeks' time. There was no anxiety about this work, no sense that it needed to be rushed. Edmund had learned to trust the seasons, to understand that everything had its proper time. The plowing would take the time it took. The field would be ready when it was ready. A soft breeze came through, bringing with it the scent of growing things, the fresh green smell of spring, of things beginning to push up through the soil, of life stirring after winter's sleep. Edmund breathed it in deeply and felt something settle in his chest, something that had no name but felt like contentment, like the sense of being part of something much larger and older than himself. After he finished eating, Edmund sat for a while longer, just resting, just being present to the moment. The oxen were dozing in their own way, standing quietly beneath the hot sun, their bodies relaxed into the stillness. Birds moved through the distant trees. Clouds drifted slowly across the sky, their shadows passing briefly over the field before moving on. The peace of the moment was so complete that Edmund almost did not notice when he began to feel the gentle stirring of readiness to work again. But after perhaps 30 minutes of rest, he became aware that his body felt refreshed, that his mind felt clear, that the idea of returning to the plow was not burdensome but welcoming. He rose slowly from the bench, stretching his arms above his head, feeling the pleasant pull of muscles that had been working hard. The oxen immediately became alert, understanding that rest was ending, that work was about to resume. Edmund untied them gently, speaking to them in soft tones, assuring them that they would continue their work now, that they would work well together as they always did. Edmund led Copper and Bess back to the field with the same unhurried pace they had maintained all morning. The sun was now high enough that the world had lost most of its shadows. The light fell more directly downward, creating a landscape of clear definition where everything revealed itself without mystery or softness. The 10th furrow began with the familiar settling of the plow into the earth. Edmund's body, refreshed from the rest, moved with renewed ease into the rhythm of the work. The bread and cheese had restored something in him, not just physical energy, but a kind of contentment that made the work feel lighter, more like something chosen rather than something endured. As he walked behind the plow, Edmund became aware of the changing quality of the afternoon. The morning had held a certain freshness, a newness that came with the early hours. But the afternoon brought something different, a deepening, a settling in. The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its long descent toward the western hills. The day was no longer young, but it was not yet old. It was in the fullness of itself, the proper time for work. The soil beneath the plow was responding beautifully. With each furrow, the earth became more receptive, more willing to be turned. The compacted soil of winter was breaking down into smaller particles. The texture was becoming finer, more suitable for seeds. Edmund could feel this improvement in the resistance of the plow. It was becoming easier to move, not because he was growing stronger, but because the earth itself was becoming more cooperative. By the time he had completed the 11th furrow, Edmund noticed something shift in the light. The angle of the sun had changed enough that the shadows, which had nearly disappeared at midday, were beginning to reappear. They were not long shadows like those of early morning, but they were there, subtle gradations of tone that suggested depth and dimension to the landscape. He worked steadily through the 12th and 13th furrows. The rhythm had become so deeply established now that Edmund could almost forget he was working. His hands knew their task. His feet knew where to place themselves. His voice knew what sounds to make to guide the oxen. All of this happened as if of its own accord, leaving his mind free to wander into the peaceful spaces that opened up within repetitive work. He found himself thinking about his son, who was now old enough to begin learning the work of farming. The boy was perhaps 14 winters old, at that age where he was no longer a child but not yet quite a man. Edmund had been teaching him gradually, showing him how to manage the animals, how to understand the seasons, and how to read the soil. But the real learning, Edmund knew, would come through doing the work itself, through the accumulation of seasons and years and repetitions, until the knowledge moved from the mind into the body, until understanding became instinct. There was no hurry to teach. Edmund would bring his son to the field soon, perhaps in a few days when more of this plowing was done. The boy would learn by watching, by doing small tasks alongside Edmund's larger work, by being present to the rhythm and reality of the work itself. And someday, when Edmund could no longer plow, his son would take up the plow and continue this same work, in this same field, following the patterns that generations had established. The thought brought Edmund a quiet sense of rightness, of continuity, of participating in something that stretched backward into time he could not remember and forward into time he would never see. It was not grandiose. There was nothing grand or dramatic about it. It was simply the natural way of things, the way knowledge and skill and care passed from one generation to the next through the medium of work itself. The 14th furrow took Edmund toward the western edge of the field. As he worked, he became increasingly aware of the changing light. The sun, which had been bright and direct, was beginning to take on the warmer tones of afternoon, moving toward evening. It had not yet taken on the amber gold of late afternoon, but it was moving in that direction. The quality of the light was beginning to shift from the clarity of midday toward something softer, more golden, more contemplative. When Edmund reached the end of the 14th furrow, he paused and looked back at his work. 14 furrows now marked the field, more than half of what would eventually be needed to complete the plowing of this particular plot. The work was progressing well. At this pace, the field would be fully plowed within 2 more days, perhaps 3 if the weather turned or if other tasks demanded his attention. But Edmund was not thinking in terms of completion or hurry. He was thinking of the present day, of this afternoon, of the work that still remained to be done before the sun began its descent toward evening. There would be time for a few more furrows before he needed to think about returning to his cottage for the evening meal. As he turned the oxen to begin the 15th furrow, Edmund heard voices coming from the direction of the village. He paused to listen. There were several people. It sounded like the miller and perhaps 2 or 3 others, walking along the path that bordered the field. Edmund recognized the miller's voice, distinctive and carrying. The group drew closer, and Edmund saw that the miller was indeed accompanied by others. A man Edmund did not immediately recognize, and a younger woman who might have been the miller's daughter or perhaps his wife's sister. They were walking slowly, as if taking the air, enjoying the warmth of the afternoon. When they saw Edmund, they raised their hands in greeting. Edmund returned the greeting and brought the oxen to a halt. The miller called out a friendly word, and the group approached to chat. "Making good progress with the plowing, I see," the miller said, gesturing toward the neat lines of turned earth. "The field is cooperating well," Edmund replied. "The soil is in good condition this year. My lad brought word that you would be bringing grain to the mill in 2 days' time," the miller said. "That will suit well. I have had a request for flour from the baker, and I will be ready for grain by then." Edmund nodded. "I will bring what I have. It should be a fair quantity. The household has eaten through most of last year's stores, and there is nothing left but to have new ground." The conversation continued for a few minutes more, talk of the weather, of the planting season ahead, of mutual acquaintances and their doings. It was the kind of easy conversation that neighbors engaged in, nothing demanding, nothing urgent, simply the maintenance of connection and community through casual exchange. When the group finally moved on, continuing their walk along the path, Edmund returned to the plow with a sense of satisfaction. These small interactions were part of the fabric of village life, threads that connected all the people in the community to one another. They required only moments, but they affirmed belonging. They confirmed that each person was known and accounted for, that each person's work was recognized and valued. The 15th furrow proceeded with the same steady rhythm as all the others. Edmund had found his pace, the sustainable rhythm that would allow him to work for many more hours without exhaustion. The oxen had also settled into this pace. They were neither hurried nor sluggish, but moving at the speed that allowed them to do good work without strain. As Edmund worked, he became increasingly aware of the changing angle of the light. The shadows, which had been barely perceptible at midday, were now becoming longer and more defined. They still did not stretch dramatically across the earth as they had in the early morning, but they were lengthening, growing more pronounced. The sun was beginning its descent in earnest now, moving down toward the western hills. The afternoon was becoming late afternoon, that particular time of day when work began to take on a different quality. The freshness of morning was entirely gone now. The clarity of midday had mellowed into something warmer, more muted. There was a kind of golden quality to everything, as if the world itself were being painted in warmer tones. Edmund completed the 16th furrow and paused to assess the light. He could work for perhaps an hour more before the sun would become too low, before the shadows would become too long and complex for clear plowing. The work had gone well throughout the day. He had accomplished a good amount, 16 furrows where perhaps 12 or 13 might have been a reasonable expectation. But Edmund was not thinking of stopping yet. The work was flowing well, the oxen were strong, and his body still held energy. He would continue for a while longer, completing perhaps a few more furrows before the evening light would force him to stop. The 17th furrow began its journey across the field. Edmund was working on the eastern side of the plot now, where the light was beginning to create interesting shadows between the turned earth and the unplowed soil. The contrasts were becoming more pronounced as the sun's angle grew more acute. His mind had settled into a deeply peaceful state now, the kind of meditative calm that came from hours of repetitive, purposeful work. Time had become almost irrelevant. There was only the plow, the earth, the oxen, and the slow, steady accumulation of completed work behind him. The world around him had become quieter as the afternoon deepened. The sounds of the village, which had been occasionally audible in the morning and midday, seemed to have faded now as people went about their indoor tasks, preparing for evening meals, completing their daily work. The birds, which had sung so actively in the morning and early afternoon, had also grown more subdued, though occasional calls and songs still came from the distant trees. There was a peacefulness to this quiet. It was not the silence of emptiness, but rather the quietness of a world settled into itself, everything in its proper place, everything doing what it was meant to do. The 17th furrow opened beneath the plow with the same consistent resistance that Edmund had come to expect. The soil was now thoroughly receptive to the work. The repeated turning had broken it down into a fine, workable texture. The plow moved through it with an ease that spoke to the quality of the work already accomplished. As Edmund walked, he noticed a subtle shift in the air. The warmth of the afternoon had not diminished, but there was a freshness beginning to move through it, the first whisper of evening beginning to stir the day. It was not cold, nothing like the chill of early morning, but it was a reminder that the day was moving toward its completion, that the sun's warmth would not persist much longer. The light had taken on that particular quality that Edmund loved most, the amber gold of late afternoon, when the sun was low enough to paint the world in warm tones, but still high enough to create clear, manageable shadows. The turned furrows cast gentle shadows now, subtle lines that emphasized the texture of the plowed earth, without the harshness of midday or the confusion of long shadows that would come near sunset. Edmund found himself slowing his pace slightly, not from fatigue but from a kind of appreciation for the quality of the moment. The work was still flowing, but he was allowing himself to become more conscious of it, to notice not just the doing but also the being, the fact of his body moving through the landscape, the oxen steady before him, the earth receiving the plow. He completed the 17th furrow and turned the oxen to begin the 18th. As they turned, Edmund glanced toward the distant village. Smoke was rising more heavily from the chimneys now as people began to prepare evening meals. He could smell it faintly in the air, wood smoke carrying the scent of cooking, of bread, of the day's sustenance being prepared for the evening gathering. His own cottage was small, just a single room on the ground floor with a sleeping loft above where he and his son rested. There would be a simple meal waiting there this evening, prepared by the woman who came from the village several times a week to help with such tasks. Pottage most likely, or bread and cheese, and perhaps some of the dried apples from last autumn's stores. Nothing elaborate, but it would be warm and nourishing and would restore what the day's work had expended. But that was still some hours away. The afternoon was not yet finished. The work could continue. As Edmund moved through the 18th furrow, He became aware of a kind of harmony settling over the landscape. Everything seemed to be moving toward evening at its own pace, the sun descending gradually, the light shifting by imperceptible degrees, the animals beginning to move toward their evening rest, the people of the village beginning to gather their work toward completion. There was no hurry in any of it, no sense of urgency. Things were simply moving in the direction that evening moved, the way water flows toward the sea. Halfway through the 18th furrow, Edmund heard a sound that made him pause, the call of a cuckoo bird, distinctive and clear, coming from somewhere in the trees beyond the northern boundary of the field. He stopped the oxen and listened. The bird called again, its two-note song carrying across the quiet landscape. Cuckoo, cuckoo. Edmund smiled slightly. The cuckoo bird had only recently returned from wherever it went in winter. Its presence was one of the sure signs that spring had truly arrived, that the turning of the seasons was real and not just the calendar's promise. The bird called once more and then fell silent. He guided the oxen forward again, completing the 18th furrow with a renewed sense of rightness. The day was progressing exactly as it should. The work was being done well. The seasons were turning in their proper way. By the time Edmund reached the end of the 18th furrow, the sun had moved noticeably lower on the western horizon. It was still well above the distant hills, but its descent was becoming unmistakable. The quality of the light had shifted again. It was warmer now, more amber than gold, and the shadows were beginning to lengthen more dramatically. Edmund paused to assess the state of the field and the state of the light. He had completed 18 furrows. The field was more than half plowed now. At this rate of progress, the entire plowing would be completed within 2 days, perhaps less if the weather held and his energy remained strong. But more immediately, Edmund was aware that the day's work was approaching its natural conclusion. The light would become too awkward within perhaps another hour or so, too long and complex in shadow, making it difficult to judge the straightness and evenness of the furrows. It was better to stop before that point, to end the day's work while the plowing remained of good quality. He began the 19th furrow, knowing it would likely be the last of the day. There was something satisfying about this, the sense of a natural stopping point approaching, the day's work coming to a conclusion that felt complete rather than interrupted. As he worked, Edmund found his mind reflecting on the day in its entirety. He had begun before dawn in darkness, with only the first pale hint of approaching light. Since then, he had watched the full arc of a day unfold, the darkness transforming into dawn, the morning freshness, the clarity of midday, the warmth of afternoon, and now the approach of evening with its deeper colors and longer shadows. It had been a full day, a complete day, a day that held within it all the variations that a day could hold. He had worked steadily through it, with breaks for rest and nourishment, but essentially continuous in his attention to the work. The work had flowed, the oxen had been steady, the soil had been cooperative. There was nothing remarkable about any of it. It was simply an ordinary day of farm work. And yet there was something profound in that ordinariness, something that seemed to touch something deep in Edmund's soul. The 19th furrow was nearly complete. Edmund could see the end of it now, the point where the plow would reach the far edge of the field. He was not thinking of what would come next. There would be tomorrow, and the day after that, and many more days to complete the full plowing of all the fields that needed turning. But for now, there was only this final furrow, only this moment, only the steady progress of the work. As he approached the completion of the furrow, Edmund became aware of a kind of profound peace settling over him. It was not the absence of anything. It was not that there was nothing to do or nothing to think about. Rather, it was the presence of a deep rightness, a sense that everything was exactly as it should be, that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. He walked the final steps of the 19th furrow with this peace settling more deeply into him with each step. The plow moved through the earth one final time. The oxen walked their final steps of the day. And then Edmund reached the end of the field, and the work of the day was complete. He brought the oxen to a halt and simply stood for a moment, breathing deeply, letting his body settle into stillness after hours of steady motion. The muscles that had been engaged throughout the day were warm and pleasantly tired. His mind, which had been focused and engaged, was beginning to drift into a softer state. Edmund turned to look back at the field, at the 19 furrows that marked his day's work. In the slanting light of late afternoon, they were beautiful, the darkness of the turned earth contrasting with the lighter stubble that remained in the unplowed portions. The parallel lines stretched across the field with an orderly precision that spoke to careful work, to attention, to skill developed through long practice. It was good work. It was work he could be satisfied with, and it was work that would continue tomorrow. He guided the oxen gently toward the path that led back to the village, back to his cottage where rest and nourishment awaited. The sun was low enough now that it shone directly into his eyes as they walked, creating a warmth on his face that felt like a benediction, a blessing bestowed on a day well spent. The walk back took the oxen and Edmund past the common meadow and along the path that skirted the edge of the village. As they walked, Edmund could see people emerging from cottages, beginning to move about in the early evening. Some were carrying water from the well. Others were gathering firewood. Children were beginning to emerge for final play before the evening meal called them inside. The church bell rang again as they passed the village. Once, twice, 3 times. 6 o'clock, Edmund counted. It had been 12 hours since the bell had first rung at 6 in the morning. 12 hours since Edmund had begun his day's work. 12 hours of steady labor, of work flowing naturally, of the day unfolding in its proper sequence. As Edmund approached his cottage, he could see smoke rising from the chimney and smell the scent of cooking more strongly. His son was likely inside, having finished his own day's tasks, tending the animals, bringing water, gathering wood. The woman from the village would have left the pottage simmering in the pot over the fire, ready for Edmund to eat when he arrived. Edmund led the oxen to their pen, unhitched them from the plow, and spent time ensuring they were comfortable for the night. He drew water for them to drink and gave them hay for their evening meal. They had worked hard through the day, and they deserved to be cared for properly. They had collaborated with him in the work, had been steady and patient and reliable. It was his responsibility to return that care. Only when Copper and Bess were settled, when Edmund had verified that they had everything they needed for the night, did he turn his attention to his own needs. He entered the cottage, ducking slightly to pass through the low doorway, and found his son already there, sitting by the fire. The boy looked up from whatever he had been thinking about, and Edmund smiled at him, a quiet, satisfied smile that spoke of a day well spent. "The plowing goes well?" his son asked. "It does," Edmund replied, settling himself on a stool by the fire. 19 furrows today. The field is more than half complete." His son nodded, absorbing this information in the way that young people did when they were beginning to learn the family trade. Edmund could see the wheels turning in the boy's mind, calculating how much remained, understanding the pace of the work, beginning to learn the rhythm that farming demanded. "Tomorrow you might come and watch more closely," Edmund said. "There is more to learn than I can teach you sitting by the fire. You will learn it by seeing it, by being present to it." His son's face brightened at this. The prospect of beginning to participate more actively in the real work of farming held appeal for him. This too was good, Edmund thought. This was how knowledge passed from one generation to the next, not through words or instruction alone, but through presence, through shared work, through the accumulation of experience over time. Edmund rose and moved to the fire, where the pottage was waiting. He ladled some into a bowl and settled back to eat. The warmth of the food, the flavors of the vegetables and herbs, the simplicity of it felt exactly right, exactly what his body needed after the day's labor. Outside the cottage, the day was continuing its progression toward night. The sun was sinking lower still, moving toward the hills, creating colors in the sky that ranged from gold to orange to deeper amber. The day was not finished. There were still hours of twilight ahead before true darkness came, but the day's active work was complete. Edmund sat by the fire, eating his simple meal, and felt the deep satisfaction that came from a day lived fully, worked fully, completed fully. There was nothing else needed. There was nowhere else to be. Everything was as it should be. After Edmund finished his meal, he remained by the fire for a time, not moving, simply existing in the warmth and stillness of the evening. His son had returned to whatever quiet task occupied him, mending a piece of harness, Edmund thought, or perhaps preparing tools for the next day. There was no need for conversation. The companionable silence of two people who lived together and understood each other was enough. The fire crackled softly, the sound gentle and rhythmic. The flames moved in their constant dance, consuming the wood slowly, releasing warmth that filled the small cottage. Edmund found his gaze drifting into the flames without really seeing them, his mind moving into that peaceful state that came after physical exhaustion, when the body had been worked hard and was now allowed to rest. Outside, the light was fading noticeably now. Through the small window of the cottage, Edmund could see the sky had taken on deeper colors. The gold and amber were still present, but they were becoming infused with rose and purple, the colors of evening deepening toward dusk. The sun was close now to touching the western hills. Edmund rose slowly, feeling the pleasant ache in his muscles as he moved. He went to the window and looked out toward the fields. In the fading light, he could barely make out the furrows he had plowed, but he knew they were there, neat and orderly, waiting for tomorrow's continuation of the work. "The day has been good," he said quietly to his son, speaking more to himself than requiring an answer. "The earth is ready. The season is moving as it should." His son looked up from his work and nodded. There was an understanding between them, a knowledge that Edmund's words held more than their simple surface meaning. They spoke to rightness, to the proper order of things, to the satisfaction that came from work done well and done in harmony with the turning of the seasons. As the evening deepened, Edmund prepared for the night in the simple way of a farmer. He moved about the cottage, checking that the fire would burn safely through the night, ensuring that the door was secured against the darkness. He prepared a simple breakfast for the morning: bread left from yesterday, cheese wrapped in cloth, a small jug of ale set to one side. By the time dawn came again, he would want to leave quickly before full light to make the most of the day's work ahead. His son climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft above, and Edmund followed, moving carefully in the dimness. There were two simple pallets there, filled with straw, covered with blankets. Edmund settled onto his, feeling the straw compress beneath his weight, feeling his body's gratitude for the support after hours of standing and walking and exerting force through the plow. The sounds of the village had quieted considerably now. Most people were indoors, gathered around their own fires, eating their evening meals, preparing for sleep. The day's work was largely complete across the village, and the evening belonged to rest and to the gathering of families. Edmund lay in the darkness of the loft, listening to his son's breathing gradually deepen and slow as the boy drifted into sleep. The sounds of the village continued to fade, a dog barking in the distance, the call of a night bird from somewhere beyond the village boundaries, the wind moving gently through the thatch of the roof. His mind was peaceful, moving through the events of the day without urgency or anxiety. The plowing had gone well. The work ahead was clear and manageable. His body was tired in the good way that came from honest labor. There was nothing pressing his thoughts, nothing demanding his attention except the simple fact of existence, of breathing, of resting after work well done. As sleep began to approach, Edmund found himself reflecting on the constancy of this life, the way each day brought the same basic structure, the same needs, the same work. To someone who did not understand, it might seem monotonous, unchanging, lacking in variety or excitement. But Edmund had learned long ago that this apparent sameness held infinite variation. No 2 days were truly alike. No 2 seasons moved in exactly the same way. The work was always the same, and yet it was always different. Spring came differently each year. The soil varied. The oxen aged and changed. The boy grew and learned. Edmund himself moved through the seasons, his body changing, his understanding deepening. Everything was in flux, and yet everything held to its proper patterns. This was the gift of farming, Edmund thought as sleep drew closer. This understanding that change and constancy were not opposites but were intertwined, that the profound variations of life could occur within the framework of simple, repeated work. Sleep came gently, the way sleep comes after a full day of honest labor. Edmund drifted into it without resistance, his body sinking into the pallets, his mind releasing its hold on the day and allowing itself to drift into the peaceful void of rest. In the darkness of the cottage, the fire continued to burn slowly, consuming the wood Edmund had prepared, keeping the small space warm through the night. The oxen rested in their pen. The village settled into evening and then into night, the people within the cottages moving through their evening routines, preparing for sleep as Edmund had done. The landscape beyond the village was quiet and dark, the fields lying at rest, waiting for tomorrow's work to resume. The stars were beginning to emerge in the sky as the last light faded from the western horizon. The night deepened, and the world moved through its nightly rhythm, carrying everything forward into the rest that followed work. Hours passed. The night deepened further. The stars moved across the sky in their slow, eternal patterns. The fire in the cottage gradually burned down to embers, releasing less heat but continuing to glow softly in the darkness. Edmund slept deeply and peacefully, his breathing matching the slow rhythm of deep rest. His body, tired from the day's work, made no demands. His mind, released from the day's engagement, moved through the undefined landscapes of sleep. Not quite dreams, not quite consciousness, but something in between, something ancient and peaceful. In his sleep, Edmund was dreaming of the fields as they would be in summer, the grain growing tall and golden, the harvest approaching, the cycle of the year moving forward. But the dream was not urgent or demanding. It was simply the continuation of his day's thoughts in the soft, fluid language of sleep. Near dawn, before the first light touched the eastern horizon, Edmund's eyes opened. He did not wake suddenly or with confusion. Rather, his consciousness simply returned gradually, the way morning itself returns, gradually, gently, without drama. For a few moments, he lay quietly, becoming aware of the new day approaching, feeling his body's readiness to rise and begin work again. He could hear nothing from the village yet. The night had not fully released its hold on the landscape, but Edmund's internal rhythm, honed by years of this same cycle, was telling him that dawn was approaching, that it was time to begin the day. He rose carefully, not waking his son, and descended the ladder to the cottage below. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cottage was still warm. Edmund added wood to the fire, coaxing it back to life, bringing new flames to drive back the darkness. He broke his fast with the bread and cheese he had prepared the evening before, washing it down with ale. The food was simple, but it was adequate, sufficient to prepare his body for the work ahead. As he ate, Edmund looked out the window toward the east. The darkness was beginning to transform, the way it did every morning. The deepest black of night was becoming gray. The stars were fading. The landscape was beginning to reveal itself in subtle shades of shadow. In perhaps another hour, the sun would rise again, and Edmund would return to the field. The 19th furrow had been the last of yesterday. Today there would be 20 more, perhaps more if the work flowed and his energy held. The field would continue its transformation from rough stubble into ordered, receptive earth. But for now, there was this moment of early morning, this time between night and day, this peaceful threshold that Edmund loved. The day had not yet begun, and yet it was approaching. He sat by the fire, warmed by its glow, and felt the peace of knowing that there was work to do and that he was ready to do it. His son would sleep for another hour or two. The village remained quiet. The fields waited. Everything was in its proper place, moving at its proper pace, guided by the seasons and the cycles that Edmund had learned to trust through long years of living in harmony with them. Edmund finished his meal and sat quietly by the fire, breathing deeply, settling himself into the readiness that came with early morning. The day was approaching. The work was waiting, and he was ready to meet both with the same patient, steady attention that he brought to everything. The attention of a man who had learned that life was best lived one day at a time, one task at a time, one moment at a time. The darkness continued to fade. The east continued to light. And soon, very soon, Edmund would rise and make his way back to the field, where the plow waited and the oxen waited, and the earth waited to receive another day's work in the ancient, holy rhythm of spring plowing. Edmund sat by the fire until the transformation from night to pre-dawn was nearly complete. The window of the cottage now showed not darkness but a deep gray blue, the color of the sky just before sunrise. The stars had faded almost completely, though a few of the brightest still held on, reluctant to release their nightly watch. He rose and moved about the cottage, preparing for the day. He checked his tools. The plow was secure in its place. The harness was in good condition. Everything was ready for the work ahead. There was a rhythm to these preparations, movements repeated so many times that they had become almost automatic. And yet Edmund brought full attention to each task, verifying, checking, ensuring that everything would serve him well through the hours ahead. His son was beginning to stir now in the loft above. Edmund could hear the boy shifting, the sounds of waking. Soon the boy would climb down, and together they would prepare for the day. Today, Edmund had decided he would bring his son to the field. It was time for the boy to begin learning more directly, to stand alongside the work, to begin to understand not just theoretically, but through direct experience what farming required. Edmund stepped outside into the pre-dawn. The air was cool, holding the chill of night, but it was not harsh. The village was just beginning to wake. A few chimneys had smoke rising from them now. A rooster called from somewhere in the distance, announcing the approach of dawn to any who might be listening. The eastern horizon was becoming increasingly bright. The colors were shifting from deep blue toward lighter shades, and hints of gold were beginning to appear at the very edge where sky met earth. Edmund stood for a moment, simply observing this transformation, this daily miracle of the night releasing its hold and light returning to the world. He went to the ox pen and greeted Copper and Bess. The animals were already alert, sensing that the day was beginning. Edmund spent time with them, speaking softly, checking that they were in good condition after their night of rest. They were well, their eyes were clear, their movement was sure. They would be ready for another day of work. By the time Edmund had finished his preparations and his son had emerged from the cottage, eating bread and cheese as they walked, the first light of true dawn was touching the landscape. It was earlier than Edmund had begun yesterday. They would have more daylight to work with today, more hours to accomplish the continuing work of plowing. They made their way toward the field, Edmund leading Copper and Bess, his son walking alongside. The boy was quiet this early in the morning, not yet fully awake, but his presence was steady. As they walked, Edmund began to speak, not lecturing but simply sharing his thoughts aloud, the way a father sometimes did when teaching a son. "You will notice," Edmund said, "how the oxen know the way. They have walked this path many times. They do not need guidance to find the field, but still we lead them because it is the proper way. We do not ask animals to think for themselves about such things. We provide direction and they follow, and in this way we work together." His son listened and nodded, absorbing the words, beginning to understand not just what farming was, but how a farmer thought about the work. When they reached the field, the sun had not yet fully risen, but the light was clear enough to see the work of the previous day. 19 furrows lay marked across the earth, neat and orderly in the early morning light. Edmund stopped and gestured toward them. "This is what one day of work looks like," he said to his son. "Not rush, not hurry, but steady, careful work from the time the light permits until the light fades. One day, and this much is accomplished. Many days, and the entire field is complete." His son looked at the expanse of work remaining, more than half the field still waiting to be plowed, and Edmund saw the boy taking in the scope of the task. It was not small work. It was not trivial, but it was the work that needed to be done, and it would be done through persistence and care. Edmund prepared the oxen and the plow while his son watched. Every movement had its purpose. Every adjustment served a function. As Edmund worked, he explained what he was doing and why, not in the way of someone impatient to finish, but in the way of someone who understood that teaching and working were not separate things but could be woven together. "The harness must fit properly," Edmund said, adjusting the leather carefully, "so that the animal is not pinched or made uncomfortable. Uncomfortable animals do not work well. They become resistant. We care for them, and in return, they give us their strength and their steadiness." His son watched, and Edmund could see the understanding beginning to form in the boy's mind. That farming was not just about getting work done, but about relationships, about understanding animals and soil and seasons as partners in the work, rather than as obstacles to overcome. By the time the sun had cleared the horizon, Edmund and his son were ready to begin. The 20th furrow of the plowing was about to start. Edmund took his place behind the plow, and his son stood nearby, close enough to see the work clearly but out of the way. With the now familiar word of command, Edmund began to move forward, and Copper and Bess responded, and the plow descended into the earth. The 20th furrow was not different from the 19 that had preceded it, and yet it was entirely new. The soil had changed from the work that had been done to it. The light was different. The temperature was different. Edmund's understanding was different, enlarged by the experience of the previous day, and his son's presence was different. The boy was learning not by hearing about farming, but by standing in the midst of it. As Edmund worked, he found himself even more conscious of the details of the work, not because they were different, but because his son was observing, and Edmund wanted to make sure the boy understood what he was witnessing. He moved with precise attention, his hands sure on the plow, his voice clear and calm as he guided the oxen. The 20th furrow proceeded steadily. The sun continued its rise, bringing more light and warmth to the landscape. The village began to stir more fully in the distance. People emerged to begin their own day's work, and Edmund could see them moving about, but he remained focused on his own task. When he reached the end of the 20th furrow, Edmund brought the oxen to a halt and turned to his son. "You see how it is done," Edmund said. "Now watch as I begin the 21st. Notice the angle of the plow, the way the earth turns, the steadiness of the pace. This is work that requires attention but does not require speed. The two are not the same thing." His son nodded, and Edmund could see that the boy was beginning to understand something important. That good work and fast work were not the same. That quality and speed could work against each other. Edmund completed the 21st furrow and then paused, bringing the oxen to rest. The morning was still young, but the work was flowing well. He could sense that today would be a productive day, that the field would continue to transform, that progress would be made. "Now," Edmund said to his son, "I will show you how to manage the oxen during the rest. Come closer, and I will teach you what you need to know." His son approached eagerly, and Edmund began to share the knowledge that he had accumulated through years of working with these animals. How to read their signals, how to know when they needed rest and when they were ready to continue, how to speak to them in ways that they understood, how to move around them without startling them. All the small, essential knowledge that made the difference between an animal that worked reluctantly and an animal that cooperated willingly. As Edmund taught, he found himself reflecting on how this knowledge would pass forward. His son was absorbing it, learning not just the words but the understanding behind them. Someday, when Edmund was old, the boy would stand in this same field, speaking to oxen in the same way, making the same small, careful movements, continuing the work that stretched backward through generations and would stretch forward through generations to come. The morning continued. Edmund and his son worked together, with the boy gradually taking on small tasks, bringing water, adjusting harnesses, learning to anticipate what would be needed next. The work was slowing slightly because of these interruptions, but Edmund did not mind. This was investment in the future, and investment sometimes required patience. By the time the sun had reached mid-morning, Edmund and his son had completed 4 more furrows, 24 in total since yesterday. The field was becoming increasingly transformed. More than half was now plowed. The work was substantial and visible. Edmund brought the oxen to a longer rest and settled with his son in the shade beneath the shelter at the field's edge. "You are beginning to understand," Edmund said, and it was not a question but a statement. "This work is not difficult, but it is steady. It asks for attention, but it does not ask for a hurry. Do you feel this?" His son thought for a moment and then nodded slowly. "It feels like there is time for it," the boy said carefully, "like it doesn't need to be rushed." Edmund smiled, pleased. His son had grasped something essential. "That is correct," he said, "and that is the gift of farming. It teaches you the proper pace for work. Not fast, not slow, but the pace that the work itself requires. When you understand this, you understand something important about life itself." They sat together in the shade, eating bread and cheese, drinking water drawn from the stream. The rest was peaceful, restorative. Around them, the day continued. Birds moving through the trees, the the sound of voices from the village, the wind carrying the scent of growing things and earth. After they had rested, Edmund rose and prepared to continue. His son rose as well, ready to observe more, to learn more, to continue absorbing the knowledge that only direct experience could teach. Edmund returned to the plow with his son's presence beside him like a steady companionship. There was something deeply satisfying about having the boy there, about sharing the work in this way. It was not that the work was easier with an observer. In some ways, it required more attention, more intentionality. But it was richer, more meaningful, connected to something larger than just the immediate task. The 25th furrow began with the same familiar descent of the plow into earth. The soil, now worked through multiple passages, was becoming increasingly fine, increasingly receptive. Edmund could feel the difference each day, the way the resistance lessened, the way the plow moved more smoothly, the way the earth seemed to welcome the work being done to it. As he walked, Edmund found himself speaking aloud, not directly to his son, but thinking out loud in a way that allowed the boy to hear his thoughts. "See how the earth changes with each passage," Edmund said. "Yesterday it was resistant, heavy. Today it is becoming lighter, more willing. This is not magic, but it is something close to magic. The way work accumulates, the way patience and attention transform things. What seems impossible in a single day becomes possible across many days." His son was walking alongside now, having learned enough to move near the work without interfering. The boy was watching carefully, his young mind taking in not just the large movements but the small details. The angle of Edmund's shoulders, the positioning of his feet, the way his voice sounded when he guided the oxen. The morning progressed. The sun climbed higher. The warmth increased gradually, but it was not yet the oppressive heat of full summer. It was the pleasant warmth of spring, the kind that encouraged growth without exhausting those who worked in it. Edmund completed the 25th and 26th furrows. The rhythm was well established now. His body moved through the patterns without conscious thought. His hands knew their work. His voice knew what sounds to make. And his mind, released from the immediate demands of technique, was free to drift into deeper thoughts. He found himself thinking about time in the way that farmers thought about it. The day was divided not into hours but into natural segments: early morning darkness, dawn light, morning work, midday rest, afternoon work, late afternoon, evening. Within each segment, different things were possible and appropriate. A farmer did not fight against these natural divisions but worked with them, honored them, allowed his activities to flow with the rhythms that the earth and sky established. By midday, Edmund and his son had added 6 more furrows to the work. 30 furrows now marked the field, and the work was substantially more than 3/4 complete. At this pace, the field would be fully plowed by tomorrow afternoon, perhaps even sooner. Edmund brought the oxen to the stream again for water and rest. His son accompanied him, and together they sat by the water, letting the coolness of the day refresh them both. "Do you understand now?" Edmund asked his son. "Why did I want you to come and see this? Why couldn't words in the cottage teach you what you needed to know?" His son was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Because it is not just knowing about it," the boy said slowly. It is being here, doing the work, understanding how long it takes, how much strength it requires, how the animals respond, how the earth changes. You can't know all that from words. Edmund nodded, pleased. His son was learning the most important lesson of all, that some knowledge could only be gained through direct participation, through presence, through the accumulation of small moments of attention over time. They rested by the stream longer than Edmund had rested alone the previous day. There was no hurry now. The work was progressing well. His son's presence justified the slower pace, the longer breaks. Teaching and learning required time, and that time was not lost from the work but rather integrated into it. As they sat, Edmund found himself telling his son stories. Not elaborate tales, but simple recollections from his own life. How his father had taught him these same skills. How Edmund had learned through similar days of watching and absorbing, and gradually taking on more of the work. How his grandfather had plowed these same fields, and how Edmund had played as a child in the furrows that his grandfather had made. This field, Edmund said, gesturing toward the work visible in the distance, has been plowed by my family for longer than I can remember. My grandfather plowed it. My father plowed it. I have plowed it for 30 winters now. And someday you will plow it, and your children will plow it after you. We are part of something that is much larger than ourselves, something that connects us to the past and to the future. His son listened to this with the seriousness of youth, trying to comprehend the scope of what Edmund was describing. The way a single field could stretch backward and forward through generations, carrying meaning and continuity through time. They returned to the field after their rest, and Edmund brought his son closer to the work itself. Today, Edmund said, you will begin to learn to guide the oxen. Not alone, I will still be managing the plow. But you will walk beside them and you will speak to them and you will begin to understand how they think, how they respond to your voice. This is essential knowledge. His son's eyes widened at this responsibility, but Edmund could see the boy was ready. There was eagerness there, and a kind of calm certainty that this was what he had been building toward. Edmund positioned his son beside Copper, the nearest oxen to the path Edmund would walk. Speak to him softly, Edmund instructed. Use the same tones you will use every day. Let him know through your voice that you are here, that you understand his task, that you are part of this work together. His son approached the animal carefully and began to speak, his young voice soft and steady. Copper, the boy said, we have work to do. The field is waiting. Will you help us? It was simple, almost like the way a child might speak to a pet, and yet there was something genuine about it, something that the animal seemed to recognize. Copper's ears turned slightly, acknowledging the sound of the boy's voice. Edmund smiled. Good, he said. You have the beginning of it. Now we will work and you will continue to speak to him to maintain this connection. Let your voice be steady like the work itself. The 27th furrow began with Edmund's son walking beside Copper, speaking to the animal softly and steadily. The boy's voice was uncertain at first, but it grew more confident as the work progressed. Edmund could see his son beginning to understand that this was not something to be anxious about. The animal was patient, willing, responsive to kindness and clear intention. As they worked, Edmund found himself profoundly moved by what was happening. His son was becoming part of the work. The knowledge that Edmund had learned through years of experience was beginning to transfer to the next generation. The continuity that Edmund had spoken of was not abstract anymore. It was real, embodied in this moment, in his son's voice speaking to the oxen, in the boy's gradual understanding of what farming required. The afternoon progressed. More furrows were completed. The field continued its transformation. The sun moved across the sky, gradually descending toward the western hills. The light, which had been strong and direct at midday, was beginning to take on the warmer tones of late afternoon. Edmund worked with the awareness that this day was different from yesterday. Yesterday he had worked alone, and the work had been meditative, peaceful in its solitude. Today he was working with his son, and the work was still peaceful, but it was peaceful in a different way, peaceful with purpose, peaceful with the sense of transmission, of knowledge moving from one generation to the next. By the time the sun was perhaps an hour from setting, Edmund and his son had completed 35 furrows in total over the 2 days. The field was nearly entirely plowed now. Perhaps 5 or 6 furrows remained, easily accomplished in a single morning. Edmund brought the oxen to their final halt for the day. His son, tired now from the day's work, stood quietly beside him, the boy's young body showing the pleasant fatigue that came from honest labor. "You have done well today," Edmund said to his son. "You have learned much. The oxen have learned your voice. You have begun to understand the work. This is good progress." His son looked at the field, at all the work that had been done, at the small amount that remained. "Tomorrow the field will be complete?" the boy asked. "Tomorrow morning," Edmund confirmed. 3 or 4 furrows and the field will be entirely plowed. Then we will move to the next field and the work will continue. In a few weeks the seeds will be planted. And then, through the growing season, there will be other work, maintaining the fields, watching for weeds, observing the growth, and eventually the harvest. His son was absorbing this, understanding that the work of the field was not completed in a single task, but was an ongoing cycle, a continuous engagement with the turning seasons. They made their way back to the cottage as the afternoon light was transforming into evening light. The sun was touching the western hills now, beginning its descent toward the horizon. The sky was beginning to show the first hints of the colors that would deepen as evening progressed. As they walked, Edmund's son began to ask questions about the coming days, about what would happen next, about how the cycle continued. Edmund answered each question patiently, sharing not just information but understanding, helping his son begin to grasp the larger patterns that governed farming life. When they reached the cottage, Edmund's son immediately went to rest, the day's work having caught up with him. The boy lay on his pallet in the loft, and within a few moments his breathing had deepened into sleep. Edmund, though tired as well, spent the evening preparing for the next day. He checked the tools, repaired a small break in the harness, prepared the simple breakfast that would sustain them through the morning. These tasks were done with the same care he brought to the plowing itself, not rushed, not mechanically, but with full attention. As full darkness fell and Edmund settled by the fire, he found himself reflecting on the day that had passed. The work had been accomplished, more furrows completed, more of the field transformed. But more than that, his son had begun to truly understand what farming was, had begun to step into the work that would be his life's work, had begun the long apprenticeship that would eventually make him a farmer in his own right. And tomorrow, the plowing of this field will be complete. A new field would await. The seasons would continue their turning, and Edmund would be there, continuing the work, continuing to teach, continuing to participate in the ancient cycle of cultivation and growth that his family had participated in for generations beyond counting. Edmund woke before dawn on the third day, as he had on the previous 2 mornings. The rhythm of early rising had become established now. His body knew when to wake without needing the church bell to mark the hour. In the darkness of the cottage, before any light touched the sky, Edmund rose and began his morning preparations. This morning felt different, though. Not in any dramatic way, but there was a sense of completion approaching, of a task nearing its natural conclusion. 3 days of work beginning to end, the field transforming from rough stubble into prepared earth ready for seeds. His son woke up as Edmund was preparing the morning meal. The boy moved more slowly than he had on the previous mornings. His young body was learning what it meant to do physical work, and his muscles were making their own argument for continued rest. But Edmund could see the determination in the boy's movements, the willingness to rise despite the fatigue. "You feel it," Edmund said to his son, and it was not a question. The work uses the body in ways it has not been used before. His son nodded, not complaining but acknowledging the truth of it. "This too is part of learning," Edmund continued. "The body learns as much as the mind does. Tomorrow you will feel less fatigue. Your muscles will remember what they did today. In a few weeks, you will be able to work a full day and feel barely tired at all. This is how the body grows and adapts." They ate their simple breakfast and made their way to the field in the pre-dawn darkness. This morning, Edmund did not need to lead the oxen. They knew the way now, and had walked the path 3 times already. Copper and Bess seemed to understand that this morning was different, that this was the final push toward completion. The eastern horizon was beginning to show its first hints of approaching light as Edmund and his son reached the field. The work that had been done over the previous 2 days was visible in the pre-dawn gray, the neat lines of turned earth, the evidence of care and attention, the transformation of the landscape. Edmund stood for a moment, simply observing. His son stood beside him, and Edmund could feel the boy's anticipation. They had spoken the previous evening about what this morning would bring: the final furrows, the completion of the field, the satisfaction of work fully accomplished. "Are you ready?" Edmund asked his son. The boy nodded, and Edmund could see that despite the physical fatigue, his son's spirit was ready, eager for the completion of this task. They prepared the oxen and the plow with the now familiar movements. Edmund's son was beginning to know these preparations almost as well as Edmund did. The positions of the harness, the way to check the plow for damage, the sequence of tasks that preceded actual work. By the time the first light was touching the landscape, Edmund was ready to begin the 36th furrow. The sun was not yet visible above the horizon, but the world was beginning to show itself in shades of gray and blue. The stars were fading. The birds were beginning to stir. Edmund took his position behind the plow, and his son walked beside Copper as he had been doing for the past day and a half. The boy's voice was confident now, speaking to the oxen with the kind of ease that came from repetition and practice. "Copper," the boy said softly, "Bess, we have final work to do. This is the last furrow of this kind for this field. After this, we move to new work. Will you help us complete it well?" There was something touching about the way the boy addressed the animals, the respect in his voice, the acknowledgement of their role in the work. Edmund felt something quiet settle in his chest, a sense of rightness, of his son stepping into a role that generations of farmers before him had stepped into. The 36th furrow proceeded steadily. The sun continued its approach to the horizon, and then, suddenly, it crested the hills to the east, and the day was fully begun. This morning, unlike the previous mornings, Edmund found himself working with a kind of heightened awareness. Not that he had not been present to his work before. He had been fully engaged both days. But this morning, knowing that the task was nearing completion, he found himself noticing details with even more intensity. The way the light touched the turned earth, the sound of Copper and Bess moving in a steady rhythm, the smell of the soil rich and alive, his son's voice growing steadier and more confident with each furrow, the feeling of the plow handles in his hands, worn smooth by years of use. All of it seemed somehow more vivid, more real, more worthy of attention. The 37th furrow was complete. 3 more remained. Edmund could see this now with certainty. 3 more furrows and the entire field would be transformed, prepared, ready for what would come next. His son was flagging slightly now, the fatigue of the work beginning to show more clearly. But Edmund did not suggest stopping. The boy was learning something important, that sometimes, when a task was nearly complete, it was worth pushing through the fatigue to see it to conclusion. That there was value and satisfaction in completion, and that it was worth the extra effort to achieve it. The 38th furrow began with his son's voice slightly quieter but still steady, still present to the work. Edmund walked behind the plow with a kind of grace, his body moving through the patterns that had become second nature to him through 30 years of repetition. The earth was beautiful in the morning light. Each furrow that Edmund had completed spoke to care, to attention, to skill developed through long practice. The field was becoming a testament to what patience and steady effort could accomplish. As Edmund moved through the 38th furrow, he found himself thinking about how this same work had been done in the spring of his father's lifetime, and in the spring of his grandfather's lifetime, stretching backward through time in an unbroken chain. And how, if God granted his son long life, this same work would continue to be done in springs yet to come, continuing the chain forward into a future Edmund would never see. The 39th furrow, the penultimate, began with renewed focus. Edmund's son, sensing that the work was very near to completion, seemed to gather energy from somewhere, and his voice to the oxen took on new clarity, new purpose. "Almost finished now, Copper," the boy said. "One more after this and we will have completed our task. One more, and the field will be ready for seeds. Edmund found himself moved by the way his son spoke to the animals, with respect, with acknowledgement of their contribution, with the understanding that this was a collaborative effort, not a dominance of human will over animal strength. The 39th furrow reached its completion. Edmund brought the oxen to a halt and looked back at the field. One furrow remained. One final pass with the plow and the work would be complete. "This one," Edmund said to his son, "you should walk beside Bess. She is the steadier of the two, and this last furrow should be walked by someone learning. She will help you learn." His son moved to Bess's side, and Edmund could see the understanding in the boy's movements. This was an honor, a recognition that the son had learned enough to be trusted with the final furrow. Edmund took his position, and with a soft word began the final furrow. His son walked beside Bess, speaking to her gently, maintaining the rhythm that had become familiar over the past day and a half of work together. The 40th furrow moved across the field. Edmund could feel the significance of it, not because it was different from the other 39, but because it was the last. After this, the work would be complete. The field would be transformed. A 3-day task would move from active work into accomplished fact. As he walked, Edmund found his gaze drifting not just to the furrows already completed, but also forward to the final line the plow would make. He could see it in his mind, the way it would look, the neat line of turned earth that would complete the transformation of the field. The plow moved steadily forward. Edmund's son walked beside Bess with the kind of quiet confidence that could only come from learning through doing. The morning light, now fully arrived and golden, illuminated everything clearly. There were no shadows deep enough to hide in now. Everything was revealed in its fullness. And then, after what seemed both like no time at all and like all the time in the world, Edmund reached the end of the field. The plow reached its final position. The 40th furrow was complete. For a moment, Edmund did not move. He simply stood, holding the plow handles, looking back at what had been accomplished. 40 furrows, neat and orderly, each one a testament to careful work, to attention, to the skill that came from long practice. The field, which 3 days ago had been rough and uneven, was now smooth and receptive, ready for the seeds that would be planted in a few weeks' time. His son stood beside Bess, and Edmund could see tears on the boy's cheeks, not tears of sadness, but tears of the kind that sometimes came when something difficult had been accomplished, when a long effort had reached its completion. Edmund brought the oxen to a halt and stepped forward to place his hand on his son's shoulder. "You have done well," Edmund said quietly. "You have learned much and you have helped complete important work. The field is ready now. The oxen have been good partners. You have been a good partner. This is how work is done, not alone but in collaboration, with patience and care and steady attention." His son looked at the field and then back at Edmund, and there was something new in the boy's face, a kind of maturity, a kind of understanding that had not been there 3 days ago. The boy had begun to understand what it meant to be a farmer, not as a concept but as a lived reality. Edmund and his son took the oxen to the stream for water and rest. The morning was still young. There were still many hours of daylight remaining, but this particular task was complete, and Edmund wanted to mark that completion with a period of rest and reflection. As they sat by the stream, Edmund spoke to his son about what came next. The field would rest now for a week or two while other tasks claimed their attention. Then, in early spring, seeds would be planted, and through the growing season, there would be work to maintain the fields, to remove weeds, to observe the growth, to understand how the plants were developing. And then, Edmund said, comes the harvest. That is harder work, more urgent work, because there is a proper time to harvest, and if you miss it, the crop can be damaged. But that is a lesson for another season. For now, you have learned the plowing. That is a good foundation. His son listened and nodded, absorbing this information about the cycle that would continue. The way the work was never truly finished, but rather moved in circles through the seasons. By midday, Edmund and his son made their way back to the cottage. The field was left behind, the work complete, the earth prepared and ready. Edmund felt the quiet satisfaction that came from accomplished work, not a dramatic satisfaction, not something that would be celebrated with fanfare or ceremony, but the deep, quiet satisfaction of knowing that a task had been done well, that skill and care and attention had been brought to bear, and that the result was good. In the cottage, Edmund's son immediately sought rest, his young body having reached its limit of what it could do in a day. The boy climbed to the loft and was asleep within moments. Edmund, though tired as well, moved about the cottage with a kind of peaceful energy. The plowing was complete. New tasks would come: maintenance, preparation for planting, other seasonal work. But for now, the major work was done, and Edmund could turn his attention to other things. He cleaned the plow carefully, removing any soil that clung to it, checking again for any damage that might need repair. He cleaned the harness and set it aside properly. He spent time with the oxen, ensuring they were well cared for, expressing his gratitude for their steady work through 3 days of labor. As evening fell, Edmund sat by the fire in his cottage and allowed himself to rest. His body ached pleasantly, the kind of ache that came from good work, from engagement with something meaningful. His mind was peaceful, settled, satisfied. Tomorrow there will be other tasks, but tonight, Edmund allowed himself to simply be present to the completion of what had been accomplished. The field was plowed. The earth was prepared. The work that had occupied 3 days had been brought to its natural conclusion. And his son had begun to understand what it meant to be a farmer, to work in partnership with animals and soil and seasons, to participate in cycles that stretched backward through time and would stretch forward into a future that Edmund would not see. It was enough. It was more than enough. Edmund sat by the fire as the evening deepened, watching the flames move through their gentle dance. His son slept deeply in the loft above, the sleep of exhaustion, the sleep of someone whose body had been worked hard and was now receiving the rest it demanded. The cottage was quiet in the way that cottages became quiet in the evening. The outside world had settled into its own evening rhythms. From the village came only occasional sounds, muted and distant. The wind moved gently through the thatch of the roof. The fire crackled softly, consuming wood, releasing warmth. Edmund's mind was drifting in the peaceful way that came after completion. He was not thinking of what needed to be done next, though there would be other tasks waiting. He was simply allowing himself to exist in the present moment, to acknowledge what had been accomplished, to let the satisfaction settle into him like the warmth of the fire. He thought about his son's face when the final furrow had been completed. There had been something profound in that moment. The boy stepping into an understanding that could not be taught through words alone, but only through presence and participation. Edmund had been doing this work for 30 years, and yet watching his son learn, it was reminding him of why it mattered, why the careful attention and steady effort were worth the expenditure of energy. The fire burned lower as the evening progressed. Edmund added no new wood to it, allowing it to consume what remained, creating the conditions for sleep. Around him, the cottage grew slowly cooler as the fire diminished, though the warmth that had been built throughout the day was not yet released. Edmund rose and prepared for sleep in the simple way of a farmer at the end of a full day. He checked that the door was secured, that the fire would not spread, that everything was in proper order. Then he climbed to the loft and settled onto his pallet beside his sleeping son. In the darkness, Edmund could hear his son's steady breathing, the sleep sound of the boy whose body had been worked to its limit and was now receiving the restoration that only deep sleep could provide. There was something peaceful about this sound, the reassurance that his son was well, that the day's exertion had not been too much, that the boy would wake tomorrow rested and ready for what came next. Edmund's own body settled into the pallet, feeling the support of the straw beneath him, feeling the blanket warming around him. Sleep was approaching, but not urgently. Edmund drifted in that space between waking and sleeping, his mind moving through the events of the day without attachment or demand, simply observing, acknowledging, letting go. Outside, the night deepened. The stars emerged as the last light faded from the western sky. The village settled into full evening, people gathering around their fires, families sharing evening meals, children being tucked into sleep. The rhythm of the day moved into the rhythm of the night, and the landscape began its nightly journey toward rest. Edmund's last conscious thought before sleep claimed him was one of gratitude for the work accomplished, for his son's willingness to learn, for the oxen's steady strength, for the soil that had cooperated with the work, for another spring arriving as it had arrived for centuries, bringing the opportunity to participate once again in the ancient work of plowing and preparing and cultivating. Sleep came gently, and Edmund drifted into it like moving into a peaceful landscape, leaving behind the day's exertion, entering into the timeless state of deep rest. Hours passed, the night deepened. The fire in the cottage burned down to embers. The oxen rested in their pen. The village was quiet, nearly everyone settled into sleep. The day's work concluded, the night's rest began. In the darkness before dawn, Edmund's eyes opened. Not suddenly, not with confusion, but gently, as if his body knew that the night was drawing toward its end. For a moment, he simply lay in the darkness, listening. His son still slept deeply beside him. Outside, the world was still in the grip of night, though the deepest darkness had passed. Edmund rose carefully, not wanting to wake his son, and descended to the cottage below. The embers of the fire were still glowing faintly, and Edmund coaxed them back to life, adding wood carefully, creating new flames. Soon the cottage had light and warmth again. He was not surprised to find that this morning felt different. The work was complete. The field no longer waited for urgent attention. Edmund could approach this day with a sense of ease rather than the focused intensity of the past 3 days. As he prepared a simple breakfast, Edmund found himself thinking about what came next. The field was plowed, but there were other fields that needed the same attention. His own holding included perhaps 5 fields that would need plowing before the seeds could be planted. At the rate he had been working with his son, building in learning and teaching, it might take another 2 or 3 weeks to complete all of them. But there was no sense of pressure about this timeline. Edmund had learned long ago that farming operated on seasonal time, not on the urgent time of commercial work or the compressed time of military campaigns. Things would be done when they needed to be done, and the doing of them was more important than the speed of accomplishment. His son emerged from the loft as Edmund was finishing his meal. The boy moved more easily this morning. The night's rest had restored him, and he seemed ready to face what the day would bring. But Edmund could see that the boy was still carrying the fatigue of the 3 previous days, though it was manageable now. "You have earned a lighter day," Edmund said to his son. "The plowing of the first field is complete. Today we will do other work, maintenance, preparation, planning for what comes next. Your body needs recovery." His son nodded, and Edmund could see relief and gratitude in the boy's face. 3 days of that level of intensity was a good beginning for an apprenticeship to farming, but it was also a lot for a young body to absorb in a short time. They made their way to the fields, but they did not go to the plowed field. Instead, Edmund led his son toward the smaller plot that held the kitchen garden, the area where vegetables and herbs grew, where the household's food supplementation came from beyond bread and grain and stored goods. "Today," Edmund said as they walked, "I will show you different work. This is not the heavy work of plowing, but it is important work. The kitchen garden feeds the household. It teaches different lessons than the plowing teaches." The kitchen garden was a modest space, perhaps 30 paces long and 20 paces wide, situated in a sunny location near the cottage. Unlike the large fields which had been plowed and left to rest, the kitchen garden showed signs of careful maintenance. Some areas had been cleared for new planting. Others held the dried remnants of last year's crops. Some showed the first green shoots of things beginning to emerge as the soil warmed. Edmund knelt in the garden and invited his son to do the same. Together, they began the work of clearing dead growth, of turning the soil carefully with hand tools rather than the plow, of preparing the beds for new planting. "This work is different," Edmund explained as they worked. "Here, we are not preparing for commercial crops. We are preparing food for ourselves, for our household. The care is different. The stakes are different. A failed large field means less to sell. A failed kitchen garden means less to eat." His son understood this immediately. The reality of depending on the garden for actual food made the work feel more immediate, more personally important. As they worked, Edmund told his son about the plants that grew here, which ones had been here last year and would return, which ones needed to be planted fresh, and which herbs were most valuable for the household. He spoke about the rhythm of the kitchen garden, the way some things could be planted early, the way others needed to wait until the danger of frost had passed completely, the way the harvest extended through the seasons if you planted carefully. The work was gentler than the plowing had been, but it was no less important. By midday, Edmund and his son had cleared the garden beds and prepared the soil for planting. It was not dramatic work, not work that created visible daily progress the way the plowing did, but it was work that would sustain the household through the year. They rested in the afternoon, and Edmund did something he had not done during the 3 days of intensive plowing. He took his son to visit with the village blacksmith. The blacksmith's forge was a place of heat and noise and energy. The smith, a man named Richard who had been working metal in the village for perhaps 20 years, was working on a series of iron tools when Edmund and his son arrived. "Bring the boy to learn," Edmund said to Richard, and Richard nodded with the kind of easy friendship that came from long acquaintance. "Come," Richard said to Edmund's son, "I will show you what happens when fire and metal meet properly." Edmund settled himself to watch as Richard took his son's attention and began to explain his craft. The boy watched, fascinated, as Richard heated metal in the forge until it glowed red with heat, then removed it and began to shape it with careful hammer blows. The metal, when heated properly, became plastic, malleable, responsive to the smith's intention. Cooled again, it held the shape that Richard had given it. Edmund sat quietly, observing both the work and his son's reaction to it. It was important for the boy to understand that while farming was the foundation of the family's life, there were other crafts, other skills, other ways of engaging with the world. The blacksmith's work depended on farmers to feed him, and farmers depended on the blacksmith to make and maintain tools. Everything was interconnected. When they left the forge in the late afternoon, Edmund's son was thoughtful, processing what he had seen. "Could I learn to do that?" the boy asked. "The blacksmith's work." Edmund considered the question carefully. It was not unusual for a farmer's son to wonder about other crafts. Some families did have sons take up different trades. "You could," Edmund said slowly, "if that was your calling, but blacksmith apprenticeships are long and demanding, and our family's land needs an heir who understands farming. I would not prevent you from learning another craft, but I would encourage you to master farming first, and then decide if there is something else you want to pursue." His son nodded, absorbing this. Edmund could see the boy's mind working, trying to imagine a future where multiple possibilities existed, where choices had to be made about which path to follow. They returned to the cottage as evening was approaching. The day had been gentler than the 3 previous days, but it had been full of different kinds of learning. Edmund's son had seen different work, had learned about the kitchen garden, and had been exposed to another craft. It was the kind of education that could only come through direct experience and exposure. That evening, as Edmund and his son sat by the fire, Edmund found himself reflecting on the past few days. A plowing had been completed. A field had been prepared. But more than that, his son had begun to truly understand what farming meant. not as a distant concept but as a lived reality, as a rhythm of work and seasons and collaboration with animals and soil and the rhythms of nature. The work would continue. There were more fields to plow, seeds to plant, a growing season to manage, eventually a harvest to bring in. But the foundation had been laid. His son was beginning to step into the role that would eventually be his, the role that Edmund's father had stepped into, that Edmund's grandfather had stepped into, that stretched backward through generations and would stretch forward through generations to come. Outside the cottage, night had fully fallen. The stars were bright in the clear spring sky. The village was settling into evening routines, and Edmund sat by the fire with his son, both of them tired from good work, both of them part of cycles that were much larger than themselves, participating in the ancient choreography of human beings working in harmony with soil and seasons and the turning of the year. The next morning brought subtle changes to the landscape. The spring that had been tentatively emerging was beginning to assert itself more boldly. The grass in the meadows was visibly greener. The buds on the trees were swelling, closer now to breaking open into leaves. The air, while still cool in the early morning, held the promise of the warmth that would come as the day progressed. Edmund and his son moved through their morning preparations with a rhythm that had become established. The cottage, the animals, the day's tasks, all of it flowed with the ease of repetition and familiarity. His son was moving more freely now, the deep fatigue of the 3-day plowing having mostly resolved, though his young body carried the memory of that effort in subtle ways. "Today," Edmund said to his son as they prepared to leave the cottage, "we will begin the second field. The work will be the same as the first field, plowing, preparing the earth, but you will find that knowing how to do it will change the experience. You have learned the work. Now you will understand it differently." His son seemed ready for this, and seemed to welcome the return to the plowing work. The boy had discovered something during the first field, a satisfaction in the steady accumulation of work, in the way attention and care created visible transformation. Edmund could see this in the way his son approached the day with quiet confidence rather than the uncertainty of the first morning. The second field was located on the other side of the village, requiring a longer walk to reach it. As Edmund and his son made their way there with Copper and Bess, they moved through the village itself, and Edmund found himself greeting people they encountered, neighbors, acquaintances, people whose lives were interconnected with his own in the complex web of village life. "You are beginning the second field?" asked the baker as they passed his cottage. "The first one was completed." 4 days ago, Edmund confirmed. "The first field is ready. We will move to the second now." The baker nodded approvingly. "Good work," he said. "The village benefits when the plowing is done well. More food means more grain for bread, which means security for all of us." It was a simple statement, but it held within it a larger truth that Edmund had been beginning to teach his son. That individual work, though it might seem small or private, was actually woven into the larger community. What Edmund did in his fields affected the baker and the miller and everyone else in the village who depended on grain. Work was never truly individual, but was always part of a larger whole. The second field was similar to the first in size and character, but had a slightly different orientation. The slope was a bit more pronounced. The soil had a different feel to it. Edmund could sense this from the way the earth looked, and from the accumulated knowledge of working these fields for 30 years. The field was ready for plowing, and Edmund could see that it had likely been left unplowed for a year or two, allowing the soil to recover from intensive cultivation. Edmund and his son prepared the oxen and the plow with the same careful attention that had marked the work on the first field. But this time, there was less instruction, less deliberate teaching. Edmund's son knew what needed to be done. The boy moved with quiet competence, and Edmund found himself simply working alongside his son rather than constantly directing. The first furrow of the second field began just as the sun was clearing the horizon. Edmund's son walked beside Copper as he had learned to do, speaking to the animal with easy confidence. The boy's voice had grown comfortable with this task. There was no uncertainty in it anymore, just steady communication between a young human and an animal that had learned to trust and respond to that communication. As they worked, Edmund found his mind drifting into deeper reflection. The work itself required his attention, but not his constant conscious thought. His hands and body knew what to do. So his mind was free to consider larger things, to think about the passing of knowledge, about the way skills and understanding moved from one generation to the next through precisely this kind of repetition and presence. He thought about his own father, who had taught him in this same way. Edmund remembered being a boy not much older than his son was now, learning to plow, learning to understand animals, learning to read the soil and the seasons. His father had been patient, much as Edmund was trying to be patient with his own son. And Edmund's grandfather had taught Edmund's father in the same way. It was a chain of transmission that stretched backward through time and would stretch forward as well. The first furrow of the second field was complete. Edmund brought the oxen to a halt and looked at what they had accomplished. One furrow in the ground, visible evidence of work beginning. Many more to come, but the beginning was always important. It established the direction, set the quality that would guide all the work that followed. His son stood beside Copper, breathing deeply from the effort, and smiled at Edmund. It was a smile of competence, of growing confidence, of understanding beginning to settle into the boy's bones through repeated action. "Well done," Edmund said simply, and saw his son's face brighten at the acknowledgement. The second, third, and fourth furrows followed in steady progression. The morning moved forward, the sun climbed higher, and Edmund and his son fell into the rhythm of work that Edmund had established during the first field. They worked together now, truly together, rather than with Edmund primarily teaching and his son primarily learning. There was still learning happening. It would continue for years, but it was the learning that came from participation rather than instruction. By midday, the second field had perhaps 8 furrows completed. They rested beneath the small shelter at the field's edge, eating bread and cheese, drinking water, allowing their bodies to recover from the morning's exertion. The sun was warm enough now that it was pleasant to sit in the shade rather than uncomfortable to be in the open. "This field feels different," Edmund's son said as they rested. "Is it?" Edmund nodded, pleased that the boy was developing the kind of sensitivity to the landscape that a good farmer needed. "The slope is steeper, and the soil has rested for 2 years. It is richer, but it is also more resistant. The plowing will be harder, but the results will be better. More grain will grow here. His son absorbed this, understanding that different fields had different characters, different needs, different responses to the work. It was not that the work was the same everywhere, applied uniformly. Rather, the work had to adapt to what the landscape required and had to work in partnership with the land's particular nature. After their rest, they returned to work with the same steady pace they had maintained in the morning. The afternoon brought the familiar progression, more furrows, more earth turned, more visible progress. Edmund found himself settling deeper into the work, into the meditative state that repetitive labor could create. His mind was becoming increasingly peaceful as the day progressed. There was no urgency in this work. The field would take as long as it took. There was no pressure to complete it quickly. The only requirement was that it be done well, that the soil be properly prepared, and that the work be carried out with care and attention. Around midway through the afternoon, Edmund became aware of a change in his son's movement. The boy was tiring. It was visible in the slight slowness of his steps, in the way his voice to the oxen was becoming quieter. But Edmund did not suggest stopping. Instead, he adjusted his own pace, slowed slightly to compensate, and allowed his son to find a sustainable rhythm that the boy could maintain. His son responded to this adjustment, and Edmund could see gratitude in the boy's face. The message was being communicated without words, that Edmund understood his son's fatigue, that Edmund was adapting to make the work more sustainable, that this was what partnership meant. By the time the sun was beginning to approach the western horizon, Edmund and his son had completed 12 furrows of the second field. It was good progress, more than half a day's work by Edmund's earlier rate, though slightly less given the additional slope and soil resistance. Edmund was not thinking about rates or productivity, though. He was thinking about the work being done well, about his son learning to sustain effort over time, about the field being gradually transformed. They brought the oxen to rest and made their way back to the cottage as the evening light was beginning to take on the warmer tones of approaching sunset. Edmund's son was quiet on the walk back, the fatigue of the day's work settling into him. It was the good kind of fatigue, the kind that came from honest labor, but it was fatigue nonetheless. That evening, Edmund's son ate his meal and then very shortly afterward climbed to the loft to sleep. Edmund sat by the fire for a time, reflecting on the progress of the past few days. The first field was plowed and rested. The second field was begun, with good progress already made. His son was learning steadily, growing into competence and confidence. Edmund found himself thinking about the larger pattern that was unfolding. His son would eventually take over this work entirely, would plow these fields year after year, would learn all the variations and particularities of each plot of earth, would understand how to work in partnership with the seasons and the oxen and the soil. It would take years, perhaps decades, for that full understanding to develop. But the foundation was being laid now, in these early spring days, through the direct experience of plowing. As the fire burned lower and the evening deepened, Edmund prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring the continuation of the second field. The day after that would bring more work on the second field, or perhaps the beginning of the third. The work would continue through the season, accumulating, building toward completion of all that needed to be done before planting season truly began. Edmund climbed to the loft and settled onto his pallet. His son was already deeply asleep, the boy's young body having claimed the rest it needed. Edmund lay in the darkness and allowed himself to drift into sleep with the sense that everything was progressing as it should, that the seasons were turning properly, that his son was beginning to step into the work that would be his life's work. Outside, the spring night deepened. The stars emerged in the clear sky. The village settled into evening rest. And Edmund slept the sleep of a man who had worked honestly through the day, whose work had purpose and meaning, whose effort was contributing to the continuation of something much larger than himself, the ancient dance of farmer and soil and seasons, the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, the participation in cycles that had continued for centuries and would continue for centuries to come. Over the following days, a rhythm established itself that was deeper and more sustaining than even the intensity of the first field's completion. Edmund and his son worked through the second field with steadily improving coordination. The boy's body was adapting to the work now. The extreme fatigue of the early days had resolved into a manageable tiredness that came at the end of each day and was resolved by sleep. More importantly, Edmund's son was beginning to develop an intuitive understanding of the work. The boy no longer needed constant guidance about when to speak to the oxen or how to position himself beside them. These things had become natural, something the boy's body knew how to do without his conscious mind directing each action. Edmund found himself speaking less and working more, and his son was filling that silence with his own understanding. They had begun to develop their own rhythm together, a pattern of work and rest that matched the particular character of the second field, the specific needs of this slope and this soil. One morning, perhaps a week into the work on the second field, Edmund arrived at the field to find his son already there, having brought the oxen from the cottage himself. The boy stood by the animals, waiting for Edmund, and there was something in his posture that suggested he had turned a corner in his understanding, that he was no longer simply learning the work, but was beginning to genuinely do the work. "I thought I would begin," his son said simply. "There is much to complete and the light is good." Edmund felt something shift in his chest, a kind of recognition and welcome for this emerging independence, this sign that his son was beginning to internalize the responsibility of the work rather than waiting to be told what to do. "That is good thinking," Edmund said. "We will work better if we begin early. Let us prepare." They worked through that day with a new sense of partnership. Edmund's son was no longer learning the work in the way a student learns from a teacher. Rather, the boy was beginning to do the work alongside Edmund in the way that co-workers collaborated, both with competence, both with understanding of what needed to be done, both contributing to a shared task. The second field progressed steadily. Furrows accumulated, 15, then 18, then 20. The slope of the field meant the work was harder than the first field had been, but Edmund and his son were developing the muscle and the understanding to manage it. More than half the field was plowed now, and the work was visible, measurable, undeniably progressing toward completion. As the second week of work began, Edmund found himself noticing small changes in the landscape around the field. The trees were beginning to show green leaves where before there had only been buds. The grass in the meadows was thicker, more vibrant, more alive. Spring was asserting itself more fully, moving from possibility into reality. During the rest at midday one day, Edmund's son asked to walk with him to the stream that ran through the property. They made their way there together, and Edmund found himself telling his son more stories, not directly about farming, but about the land itself, about the history of it, about the people who had worked it before. "My grandfather," Edmund said as they sat by the water, "plowed these same fields. He worked them during the time of the great winter when the snow lay deep for many months. He told me that farming teaches you patience in a different way when the seasons are harsh. You cannot rush the earth. You cannot demand it give more than it is able. You can only do your part and accept what comes." His son listened and looked out at the water, watching it flow steadily toward the village and beyond. "What happens if the harvest is very poor?" the boy asked. "If the work is done well but the season is not kind?" Edmund considered this carefully. It was an important question, one that touched on the reality of farming, that even good work could not guarantee good results, that there was always an element of chance, of dependence on factors beyond human control. "Then we do without," Edmund said simply. "The village has stores, people share. We tighten what we can and wait for the next year. I have lived through hard years. They are difficult, but they are survivable. And they teach you something important, that the work is valuable not just because of what it produces, but because of what it is in itself. The work is worth it even if the harvest is poor." His son was quiet, absorbing this. Edmund could see the boy thinking, beginning to understand that farming was not a guarantee, but rather a participation in forces much larger than human will or human effort. They returned to the field and continued the work, completing more furrows through the afternoon. The sun was warm enough now that the work itself generated warmth in their bodies, and the morning chill seemed like something from a different season entirely. By the end of the second full week of work on the second field, perhaps 30 furrows had been completed. The field was approximately 3/4 plowed, and the rhythm of completion was becoming visible. Another few days of work, perhaps 4 or 5, and the field would be entirely prepared, ready for rest before planting. Edmund found himself thinking about the third field, and the fourth, and the fifth. There was a great deal of work remaining before the planting season fully began, but he was no longer thinking of this as a burden. Rather, he was thinking of it as the natural expression of the season, the work that the season demanded, the participation in rhythms that were much older and much larger than any individual person. One evening, as Edmund and his son sat by the fire after their meal, Edmund made a decision. "The next field," he said to his son, "I think you should help me choose which one we do. Come with me tomorrow and we will walk the property together. I will show you how to read the fields, how to understand which field is most ready for plowing, which field should wait longer. This too is part of the knowledge a farmer needs." His son's face brightened at this prospect. the responsibility of helping make decisions, the trust that Edmund was placing in him, the recognition that the boy's judgment had value. The next day, Edmund and his son walked the property together. Edmund showed his son all 5 of the fields that would need plowing before planting began. They walked through each one, and Edmund explained what he saw, which fields had the best soil, which ones had been worked less recently and therefore would be more resistant, which ones had particular characteristics that would affect the timing and the work required. "This one," Edmund said, pointing to a field on slightly higher ground, "will be ready soonest. The sun touches it more directly, warming it more quickly. The soil here is lighter, more willing to be worked. This is where we will go after the second field is complete." His son looked at the field carefully, trying to see what Edmund saw, beginning to learn the subtle language of the land that a farmer needed to understand. "And this one?" the boy asked, pointing to a different field that lay partially in shadow. "This one will wait," Edmund said. "It is lower, damper. It will be ready perhaps a week after the others. If we try to plow it too early, the soil will be too wet, and we will damage the structure of the earth. Patience with this one is necessary." They walked through all 5 fields, and Edmund explained the particular character of each one. By the time they returned to the cottage, Edmund's son had been given a different kind of education, not the education of doing the work, but the education of reading the landscape, of understanding what the land required, of learning to work with natural conditions rather than against them. That night, Edmund felt a kind of satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of completed work. This was the satisfaction of teaching, of seeing his son beginning to understand not just how to do the work, but how to think about the work, how to make decisions about the work. The following morning, Edmund and his son returned to the second field and completed the final stretch of plowing. The work moved quickly now. The field was nearly 3/4 complete, and the end was visible and approaching. By midday, the 35th furrow was complete, and Edmund could count on his fingers how many remained. The afternoon brought the completion of the 36th, 37th, and 38th furrows. By the time the sun was approaching the western hills, Edmund and his son had completed the 39th furrow, and there was only one remaining. Edmund brought the oxen to a halt and looked back at the field. This was the moment that was beginning to feel familiar now. The final furrow approaching, the work nearing completion, the satisfaction of near finality beginning to settle. "This last one," Edmund said to his son, "you should walk beside Bess again, as you did for the first field. It is fitting that the final furrow of this field is walked by you." His son moved into position, and Edmund took his place behind the plow. With the familiar soft word, they began the final furrow. Edmund's son's voice to the oxen was confident now, easy, the product of nearly 2 weeks of repeated interaction and learning. The boy was no longer an apprentice learning to speak to animals. The boy was a young farmer communicating with his working partners. The final furrow moved across the field. The light was golden now, warm and mellow, the light of late afternoon in spring. The turned earth was dark and rich behind them. The work was nearly complete. And then, just as had happened with the first field, Edmund reached the end of the property, and the plow came to its final position. The 40th furrow of the second field was complete. The entire field was now plowed, prepared, ready for what would come next. Edmund brought the oxen to a halt and stood for a moment, simply observing. His son stood beside Bess, and Edmund could see the boy's face. The satisfaction there, the sense of accomplishment, the understanding that significant work had been accomplished. 2 fields, Edmund said to his son. 2 fields plowed, 2 fields prepared. 3 more remain, but the work goes well and we are learning together. His son nodded, and there was something settled and confident in the boy's bearing now. The uncertainty of the beginning was entirely gone. In its place was the quiet confidence that came from repeated success, from learning being integrated into capability. They brought the oxen to rest by the stream, and Edmund and his son sat together in the golden light of late afternoon. Tomorrow they will begin the 3rd field. The work would continue, but tonight they simply sat and allowed themselves to rest, to acknowledge what had been accomplished, to be present to the moment of completion before moving on to the next task. The spring evening deepened around them, peaceful and full of the sense of seasons turning, of work being done in harmony with those turning seasons, of participation in cycles that stretched backward through time and forward into the future. The 3rd field began under different conditions from the first 2. As Edmund and his son approached it in the morning after completing the 2nd field, Edmund noticed that the boy moved with a different kind of readiness, not the eager curiosity of the first morning, nor the growing competence of the recent days, but something more settled, more grounded. His son had begun to understand that this work was not a novelty to be completed, but rather a pattern that would repeat, a rhythm that would define the coming years of his life. The 3rd field was the one they had chosen together during their walk of the property. It was indeed ready early. The higher ground had warmed more quickly as spring advanced, and the soil was responsive and willing. Edmund could feel this as he prepared the plow, could sense that this field would be easier work than the 2nd had been. This field, Edmund said to his son as they prepared, should move more quickly. The soil is favorable. The slope is gentler. We may complete this one in perhaps 5 days of work, possibly fewer. Do not rush, but do not be surprised if the work flows faster than before. His son nodded, taking in this information, adjusting his expectations accordingly. Edmund was beginning to recognize that his son was developing not just the physical skill of the work, but also the mental understanding of how different conditions affected the pace and difficulty of the labor. The 1st furrow of the 3rd field was completed by mid-morning. The sun was warm, warmer than it had been in the early days of the plowing season. The trees were now dressed in fresh green leaves, the transformation from dormancy to vitality nearly complete. The landscape around them was visibly more alive than it had been even a week ago. Edmund worked alongside his son with the easy rhythm they had developed. There was less instruction now, less deliberate teaching. When Edmund needed to show his son something, it was done briefly, and then they returned to work. The work itself had become the primary mode of communication and learning. By midday, 3 furrows of the third field were complete, and Edmund found that his earlier prediction seemed likely to be accurate. The work was indeed flowing more easily. The soil was cooperating. The oxen were working well. There was a quality of ease to the morning's labor that had not been present during the more demanding work on the second field. They rested at their usual spot, and Edmund's son asked if they could walk the property again. "I want to understand the fourth field," the boy said, "and I want to know what you look for when you are choosing when to plow." Edmund was pleased by this question. It showed his son was not simply learning through direct instruction, but was actively thinking about the work, trying to understand the larger pattern of decision-making that governed when and where and how the plowing proceeded. They walked together to the fourth field, and Edmund spent time explaining his observations. The field was lower than the third, with a slightly damper character. The soil, while good, would need to warm more before it was ideal for plowing. Another week, Edmund thought, would see it ready. "But how do you know?" his son asked. "How can you tell if the soil is too wet or if it is ready?" It was an excellent question, and Edmund found himself kneeling in the field, taking up some soil in his hands, showing his son how to feel the texture and how to understand what moisture level felt right. "You feel it," Edmund said simply, pressing the soil gently. "You learn through your hands what ready soil feels like, and you learn what happens if you plow soil that is too wet. The earth becomes compacted, it loses its structure. It becomes harder rather than easier to work. So you wait. You trust your hands and your experience, and you wait for the soil to tell you it is ready." His son watched carefully, trying to memorize this lesson, understanding that this was not information that could be learned from words alone, but rather knowledge that had to develop through direct experience over time. They returned to the third field and continued the afternoon's work. 4 more furrows were completed, bringing the total for the day to 7. It was good progress, and Edmund could see that the work on this field would indeed move quickly. Over the next few days, a pattern established itself. The third field progressed rapidly. 8 furrows completed on the second day, 9 on the third day. By the 4th day of work on the field, Edmund and his son stood facing the final furrow. It had taken only 4 days to complete this field, compared to perhaps 5 or 6 for the second field and 3 for the first field. "The difference in soil," Edmund explained to his son as they prepared for the final furrow, "shows itself in the time required for work. Better soil, easier slope, warmer conditions, all of these make the work move faster. It is not that we are working harder or faster. It is simply that the conditions are more favorable." His son completed the final furrow beside Bess, and Edmund felt the now familiar satisfaction of completion. 3 fields done, 2 remained. The 4th field, when they began it 2 days later after allowing the third field to rest, was indeed more challenging than the third but manageable. The lower ground and slightly damper soil made the work a bit heavier, but Edmund and his son moved through it with established competence. The work no longer felt new or uncertain. It had become routine in the best sense, familiar, repeatable, something that could be done with attention and care without constant novelty or surprise. It was during the work on the fourth field that Edmund began to notice something different in his own experience of the labor. He had been plowing for 30 years, but he found himself seeing the familiar work through new eyes, seeing it through the lens of his son's learning and developing understanding. One afternoon, as they worked, Edmund's son asked a question that made him pause and really consider what they were doing. "When will I be able to do this alone?" the boy asked. "When will I be able to manage the plowing by myself without you being here?" Edmund brought the oxen to a halt and considered the question seriously. "That is a good question," he said, "and the answer is that it will take time. Months of this work, perhaps, and even after months, you may not feel entirely ready. But readiness sometimes comes not from feeling entirely prepared, but from stepping into the work and discovering that you are capable of managing it. I think perhaps by the summer, if we continue as we are, you could manage a field with me nearby but not actively working. By next spring, perhaps you could begin fields on your own, with me checking your work rather than working alongside you." His son absorbed this timeline, understanding that the learning would continue for many more months, that mastery was something that developed gradually over time, rather than something that could be achieved quickly. The fourth field was completed in 5 days of work, and Edmund and his son moved directly to the fifth and final field. This one was lower still, and Edmund could see that it would be the most demanding of all the fields. But he felt ready for it, and he could see that his son felt ready as well. The final field held a particular quality, though. Edmund realized as they began it that this had been the last field that he had plowed every year for the past 30 years. It was the field that lasted for a reason. It was the most difficult, the most resistant. And Edmund had learned long ago that it was better to approach it after other fields had been completed and confidence had been built. The work on the final field was heavy, demanding, requiring the kind of sustained effort and attention that Edmund had brought to the second field. But Edmund's son was ready for it now in a way the boy could not have been ready a month ago at the beginning of the season. One morning, perhaps midway through the fifth field, Edmund arrived to find his son already at work. The boy had begun the day alone, had managed the oxen, and had started the work without waiting for Edmund's arrival. When Edmund appeared, his son acknowledged him but did not stop or pause in his labor. He simply continued, incorporating Edmund's presence into the work rather than waiting for Edmund to direct what should happen. Edmund felt something shift in his understanding of what was happening between them. This was no longer simply a father teaching a son. This was becoming something different, a collaboration between two farmers of different experience levels, both competent, both capable, both bringing their understanding to bear on shared work. It was during this final field that Edmund found himself thinking more deeply about the larger meaning of what was happening. The plowing would be completed soon. The fields would be prepared. Seeds would be planted. And then the work would continue through the growing season, different work, less intensive in some ways, more demanding in others, requiring different kinds of attention and care. But what mattered most, Edmund found himself thinking, was not the completion of any individual task. What mattered was that his son was being woven into the work, becoming part of the continuity that stretched backward through generations and would stretch forward through generations to come. The boy was not learning these skills as abstract knowledge. He was learning them as a lived practice, as a way of being in the world that connected him to his ancestors and would connect him to his descendants. The fifth field progressed steadily. Day after day, more furrows were completed. The work was hard but manageable. Edmund and his son fell into the deepest rhythm of the season, work flowing day after day, rest following work, the accumulation of completed labor creating visible progress through the landscape. And then, on a morning when the spring had fully established itself, when the trees were dressed in full green and the world seemed entirely awake and alive, Edmund and his son completed the final furrow of the final field. 5 fields, approximately 200 furrows in total, nearly a month of sustained, focused work. And now, standing at the edge of the last field, looking back at what had been accomplished, Edmund and his son stood in a profound competition. "It is done," Edmund said simply. "All the fields are plowed, all the earth is prepared. Now we rest and we prepare for planting." His son looked at the transformed landscape, at the fields that had been rough and uneven, and were now smooth and receptive, ready for the seeds that would be planted in a few weeks' time. "I did this," the boy said quietly, not as a boast but as a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of what his own effort and learning had contributed to. "We did this," Edmund corrected gently. "Together. And because of it, the fields are ready. Because of it, the village will be fed. Because of it, the work continues as it has always continued, as it will continue beyond both of us into the future." They brought the oxen to the stream for water and rest, and Edmund and his son sat by the flowing water in the full warmth of spring afternoon, both of them tired in the good way that came from work well accomplished, both of them knowing that the most demanding work of the season was complete, that what came next would be different work, requiring different skills, demanding different kinds of attention. But for now, they rested. And in that rest, Edmund felt the deep satisfaction of a season well lived, of knowledge transmitted, of continuity maintained, of participation in the ancient and ongoing work of human beings collaborating with the earth and the seasons to nurture life and growth. The warmth of the spring afternoon settled around Edmund and his son as they sat by the stream, the water moving gently over smooth stones that had been worn by countless seasons of flowing water. The plowing was complete. 5 fields lay prepared behind them, their work visible and real across the landscape. Edmund reached down and drew cool water in his cupped hands, drinking deeply, feeling the earth's blessing flow through him. His son did the same, and for a long while they simply sat in the peaceful silence that follows the completion of great labor. The world around them continued its own quiet rhythms. A bird moved through the overhanging branches, searching for things only it understood. The grass beneath them was soft and green, alive with the fullness of spring. The distant village was visible beyond the meadows, smoke rising from chimneys, people moving about their own days, their own work, their own lives woven into the same great pattern that Edmund and his son were part of. "Next spring," Edmund said softly, speaking not as instruction but simply as a sharing of thought, You will come back to these fields. The grain will have grown through the summer. You will see what your work has made possible. The plants will draw their life from the soil you prepared. And that understanding will change you. His son leaned back, resting his elbows on the ground behind him, looking up at the sky where clouds moved slowly in wind that touched only the heights. "I feel different already," the boy said quietly. "I feel like I understand something now that I did not understand before. It is not just work. It is bigger than that." Edmund nodded, pleased that his son was beginning to grasp the deeper truth of what farming meant, not as labor to be accomplished, but as participation in something sacred and ancient, something that connected a person to earth and seasons and generations. They sat together in the warmth and the peace, the stream flowing past them, time moving in its own way, carrying them gently forward into the evening that would come, into tomorrow that would bring different work, into the weeks and months and years that would continue the cycle that they had now truly begun together. The sun continued its slow descent toward the western hills. The light remained golden and full, rich with the promise of summer approaching. And Edmund and his son sat by the stream at rest after great work, at peace in the knowledge that they had done what needed to be done well, that the fields were prepared, that the cycle would continue. Behind them lay the plowed fields, 5 fields transformed, ready for seeds, ready for the growing season. And ahead of them lay the continuation of seasons, the continuation of work, the continuation of the ancient and unbroken chain of farming families who had worked this earth and would work it still. For now, there was only this moment: the water, the warmth, the peace of completion, the deep and quiet satisfaction of work well done in partnership, of knowledge transmitted, of continuity honored. And in this moment, beneath the golden spring sky, Edmund and his son rested, content in the knowledge that they had participated in something far larger than themselves, something that would continue long after they were gone, something that had begun long before they arrived. The earth beneath them was solid and real. The work was finished, and all was well.